Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of the most romanticized yet absolutely brutal professions in medieval history, the assassin. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I read everyone's comment. It's a small way to feel connected. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's shatter some illusions, right away. Everything you think you know about medieval assassins is wrong. Dead wrong. The popular image of the assassin, the mysterious figure in flowing black robes, trained in secret mountain fortresses, wielding exotic weapons and possessing almost supernatural stealth abilities. That's not history. That's fantasy, wrapped in a thin veneer of historical marketing. The word assassin itself comes from the Arabic hashishin, referring to a very specific group of Ismaili Muslims who operated in Persia and Syria between the 11th and 13th centuries. But even they weren't the superhuman killers of legend. They were politically motivated operatives who used murder as a tool of statecraft, often working in broad daylight and frequently dying in the attempt. Real medieval assassins weren't ninja-like shadows. They were desperate people, political, extremists, hired killers, and occasionally religious fanatics. Most were amateur murderers with no formal training, poor equipment, and even worse life expectancy. They didn't learn ancient martial arts in hidden dojos. They learned to kill the same way everyone else did in the Middle Ages, through necessity, desperation, and usually by watching someone else die first. The historical record shows us tavern brawlers turned contract killers, ex-soldiers with nothing left to lose, political dissidents, religious zealots, and common criminals who discovered they had a talent for ending lives quietly. These weren't the elegant death dealers of fiction. They were often illiterate, malnourished, and carrying diseases that would kill them before any enemy blade could. And here's the kicker. Most medieval assassins weren't even particularly good at their job. Success rates were abysmal. For every successful political murder, there were dozens of failed attempts that ended with the would-be assassin being tortured, executed, or both. The ones who succeeded often died immediately afterward, either from their target's guards or from their own employers who wanted to eliminate witnesses. You wouldn't have been trained in exotic fighting techniques. You wouldn't have had access to precision-crafted weapons. You wouldn't have been part of some shadowy brotherhood with ancient wisdom and unlimited resources. You would have been alone, poorly equipped, probably hungry, and almost certainly doomed. The medieval world was brutal enough for ordinary people. For assassins, it was a nightmare wrapped in shadows and delivered with a rusty blade. Chapter 2. How you actually became an assassin. Nobody woke up in medieval times and thought, you know what sounds like a great career? Professional murder. Becoming an assassin wasn't a choice. It was what happened when all your other choices had been stripped away. Most assassins started as something else entirely. Maybe you were a soldier whose army disbanded after a war ended, leaving you with military skills, but no legitimate way to use them. Perhaps you were a merchant who lost everything to bandits or corrupt officials and needed money desperately, enough to do anything. You might have been a craftsman whose guild expelled you, a farmer whose land was seized, or a scholar whose patron died, leaving you with education but no means of survival. The path usually began with smaller crimes, theft, smuggling, maybe some light intimidation work for loan sharks or corrupt merchants. You'd develop a reputation as someone willing to bend rules, to do things others wouldn't. Word would spread through the underground networks that existed in every medieval city. The criminals, the desperate, the morally flexible. Then someone would approach you, never directly, of course. It would be a friend of a friend who knew someone who might have work for a person with your particular flexibility. The job wouldn't be called assassination at first. It would be solving a problem, or delivering a message, or ensuring someone understands the consequences of their actions. The pay would be tempting. More money than you'd seen in months, maybe years. enough to eat well, to buy better clothes, to rent a room instead of sleeping in ditches. For someone at the bottom of medieval society's ladder, that kind of money was impossible to refuse. But here's what they wouldn't tell you. Accepting that first job was signing your own death warrant. Not because the job itself was necessarily fatal, though it might be, but because you were crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. Once you were known as someone who would kill for money, you became valuable to some people and incredibly dangerous to others. Both groups had excellent reasons to want you dead. Your first target probably wouldn't be someone important. It would be a small-time merchant who was cheating the wrong people, a priest who was asking too many questions, a local official who couldn't be bribed, someone whose death wouldn't cause too much investigation, but would serve as a warning to others. You'd spend days or weeks learning their routine, finding the right moment, working up the courage. And when you finally made your move, if you didn't freeze, if you didn't botch it, if you didn't get caught, you'd discover something that would haunt you forever. Killing someone is easy. Living with having done it is the hard part. But by then, it would be too late. You'd be part of the shadow economy of violence that existed alongside the legitimate world. And once you were in, there was only one way out. Chapter 3. Your training. Forget everything you've seen about assassin training. There were no secret academies, no wise masters, no years of disciplined practice in hidden mountain fortresses. If you became a medieval assassin, your training consisted of exactly 3 things: desperation, experience, and luck. And luck was the most important one. Most assassins learned their trade through trial and error, with heavy emphasis on the error part. Your first lesson wouldn't be stealth techniques or exotic weapons handling. It would be this: don't get caught. Everything else was secondary. If you were lucky, you might learn from someone who'd survived a few jobs. They'd teach you basic principles. Always know your escape route. Never trust your employer completely. Don't use your real name, and always assume someone is watching you. But these weren't professional techniques passed down through generations of master killers. These were survival tips from people who'd managed not to die yet. Weapon training. Laughable. You'd use whatever you could get your hands on. An eating knife was the most common weapon, easily concealed and readily available. Some assassins preferred garrotes, simple cords or thin ropes that could strangle quickly and quietly. Poison was rare and unreliable, despite what stories might suggest. Most medieval poisons were plant-based and unpredictable in their effects. Crossbows were occasionally used, but they were expensive, conspicuous, and difficult to reload quickly. Swords were out of the question for most assassins. They were noblemen's weapons, expensive and attention-grabbing. An assassin with a sword was like a beggar wearing silk robes. It marked you as either a thief or someone trying very hard to be noticed. Your stealth training consisted of learning to walk quietly on different surfaces, how to move in shadows, and how to blend into crowds. But these weren't mystical ninja techniques. They were common sense applied to criminal activity. Stay in the dark, don't make noise, don't stand out. The same skills used by every thief, smuggler, and night soil man in the medieval world. What about physical conditioning? Combat training? Forget it. Most assassins were actually in poor physical condition. Malnutrition was common, diseases were rampant, and the stress of constantly looking over your shoulder took a serious toll. You'd be more likely to die from dysentery than from an enemy blade. The closest thing to formal training most assassins received was religious instruction. Many belonged to political or religious movements that provided them with ideological justification for their actions. The original Hashishin were motivated by their interpretation of Ismaili Islam. Christian assassins might justify their actions as serving God's will, but even this training was really just indoctrination, designed to make you more willing to die for the cause. In the end, your education as an assassin would be written in blood, mostly other people's, but probably some of your own. Every job would teach you something new about human nature, about death, about fear, and every lesson would cost a piece of your soul. Chapter 4. Your equipment and weapons. Now let's talk about your gear. Spoiler alert, it was garbage. While fictional assassins glide through shadows with elegant hidden blades, poisoned darts, and exotic weapons crafted by master smiths, real medieval assassins made do with whatever they could steal, buy cheaply, or improvise. Your arsenal would be pathetic by any standard. Your primary weapon would be a simple knife, not a specially designed assassin's blade, not a Damascus steel masterwork, just a common eating knife, or maybe a slightly larger utility blade, if you were fortunate. The blade would be iron, not steel. Steel was expensive, and good steel was beyond your means. It would be poorly maintained, because you couldn't afford proper care. And it would probably be dull, because sharpening stones cost money. This knife would serve multiple purposes. It was your weapon, your tool, your last resort, and your constant companion. You'd eat with it, use it for basic tasks, and hopefully, kill with it when the time came. The fact that it had to serve all these functions meant it wasn't particularly good at any of them. Poison was the stuff of legends and wealthy patrons. Real poison was difficult to obtain, expensive to purchase, and unreliable in effect. Most medieval poisons were plant-based concoctions with unpredictable potency. You might brew something that would kill your target, or you might create something that would just give them a stomachache. Worse, you might accidentally poison yourself in the preparation or application. The most common poisons available to medieval assassins were things like hemlock, wolfsbane, or various toxic mushrooms. But identifying and preparing these required knowledge most assassins didn't possess. A mistake in preparation could kill you, and even a correctly prepared poison might not work as expected. Medieval medicine had no understanding of dosage, metabolism, or toxicology. Your clothing would be whatever helped you blend in with your target's environment. If you needed to approach a noble, you'd try to acquire servant's clothing, or perhaps the robes of a monk or priest. If your target was a merchant, you'd dress as a trader or craftsman. But acquiring convincing disguises was expensive and difficult. Most of the time, you'd just try to look unremarkable. Armor was out of the question. Real armor was incredibly expensive, and wearing it would make you conspicuous and slow. At most, you might have a leather vest or perhaps some thick cloth padding, but these offered minimal protection and were mainly psychological comfort. Your tools for breaking and entering were equally primitive, a simple pry bar, maybe some thin metal pieces for manipulating locks, a coil of rope if you could afford it. Lockpicking was a skill few possessed, and medieval locks were often more about deterrence than actual security. Most break-ins involved finding an unlocked door or window, bribing a servant, or simply waiting for an opportunity. Communication equipment didn't exist. You had no way to contact backup, no means of calling for help, no method of coordinating with others. If something went wrong, you were entirely on your own. Your total equipment might have been worth a few silver coins at most. Compare that to a knight's equipment, which could be worth more than a small farm, and you begin to understand just how poorly equipped assassins really were. You weren't precision instruments of death. You were desperate people with sharp objects, hoping to get close enough to your target to use them. Chapter 5. Living conditions and daily life. The life of a medieval assassin wasn't spent in comfortable safe houses or well-appointed hideouts. It was the existence of constant movement, paranoia, and squalor that would break most modern people within days. You couldn't stay anywhere for long. Establishing routines or forming relationships was dangerous because both could be used to track you down. You'd sleep in different places each night, abandoned buildings, haylofts, under bridges, in forests. Sometimes you'd pay for a night in a flophouse or tavern, but only when you had money and only when you were confident no one was actively hunting you. The sleeping arrangements were horrific. Medieval hygiene was poor under the best circumstances, and yours would be non-existent. You'd go weeks without bathing, washing only when you could find a stream or river, and only when you were certain you wouldn't be spotted. Your clothing would be filthy, infested with lice and fleas, and would smell terrible. This actually worked. in your favor in some ways. Most people in the Middle Ages smelled bad, so you wouldn't stand out. Food was a constant problem. You couldn't hunt because that required equipment and skills you probably didn't have. You couldn't farm because you couldn't stay in one place. You couldn't practice a legitimate trade because that would make you traceable. Most of your food would be stolen, begged, or purchased with the proceeds from your jobs. When you could afford it, you'd eat the same poor quality food available to all medieval peasants: coarse bread, thin porridge, perhaps some cheese or dried meat if you were fortunate. More often, you'd eat whatever you could find or steal: scraps from tavern waste, food stolen from market stalls, or the occasional meal given to you by someone who took pity on an obviously desperate person. Disease was your constant companion. Without access to clean water, adequate nutrition, or basic medical care, you'd be sick most of the time. Dysentery, parasites, respiratory infections, and skin diseases would be normal parts of your existence. Any serious injury or illness would probably be fatal because you couldn't seek help from legitimate healers who might ask questions. Mental health was another major issue, though medieval people didn't understand it in modern terms. The constant stress of being hunted, the isolation from normal human contact, the guilt and trauma from your work, and the generally horrific living conditions would have devastating psychological effects. Many assassins probably suffered from what we'd now recognize as severe depression, anxiety disorders, and post-traumatic stress. You'd live in a state of constant vigilance. Every stranger might be a threat. Every sound in the night might herald your discovery. Every change in routine might signal danger. This level of sustained stress would wear down your physical and mental health rapidly. Social interaction would be minimal and superficial. You couldn't afford to trust anyone completely, and you couldn't let anyone get close enough to learn your secrets. Relationships, friendships, and family connections were luxuries you couldn't afford. You'd be isolated in the most fundamental way possible, surrounded by people but unable to truly connect with any of them. The psychological toll of this existence can't be overstated. Humans are social creatures, and cutting yourself off from normal human contact while living in constant fear and discomfort would drive most people to madness. The fact that some medieval assassins managed to function at all under these conditions is remarkable. Chapter 6. The Economics of Murder. Let's talk money, because that's what it really came down to. Assassination was a business, and like most medieval businesses, the economics were terrible for the people actually doing the work. Payment for assassination. Jobs varied wildly, but it was never as much as the risk warranted. A contract to kill a minor noble might pay anywhere from a few silver coins to a small bag of gold, depending on the danger involved and the wealth of the person commissioning the job. But even a well-paying assassination contract rarely provided enough money to live comfortably for more than a few months. The payment structure was designed to exploit you from the beginning. Clients typically paid only a portion up front, with the remainder due upon completion of the job. This meant you had to fund most of your preparation and expenses from your own resources, and there was always the risk that the client would refuse to pay the remainder, or might even have you killed to avoid payment altogether. Operating expenses were higher than you might think. Bribes were often necessary to get information about your target, to gain access to restricted areas, or to ensure that certain people would look the other way at crucial moments. These bribes could eat up a significant portion of your payment before you even attempted the job. Travel costs were another major expense. If your target wasn't local, you'd need money for food and lodging during the journey. Medieval travel was slow, expensive, and dangerous, especially for someone trying to avoid attention. You couldn't take the direct routes used by merchants and pilgrims because those were well watched and well traveled. Equipment replacement was an ongoing cost. Weapons broke or were lost. Clothing wore out or became too recognizable. Bribes sometimes included providing information about your methods or appearance to your enemies. You'd constantly need to acquire new gear and change your appearance. But the real economic problem was the lack of steady income. Assassination jobs weren't regular employment. You might get several contracts in quick succession, followed by months with no work. During the dry periods, you'd have to find other ways to survive, which usually meant petty crime, manual labor, or working for criminal organizations in other capacities. The most successful assassins weren't those who were best at killing, they were those who were best at managing the business side of murder. They could find clients, negotiate payments, manage expenses, and most importantly, build networks of contacts who could provide information, resources, and protection. But building these networks required social skills, business acumen, and a reputation for reliability that most people entering the assassination trade simply didn't possess. Many assassins ended up in debt to loan sharks or criminal organizations, which effectively made them indentured servants to the criminal underworld. They'd take increasingly dangerous jobs, not because the pay was good, but because they needed money to pay off their debts and stay alive. The irony is that assassination, despite being one of the most dangerous professions imaginable, was also one of the least profitable for the people actually taking the risks. The real money was made by the people who arranged the contracts, provided information, or financed the operations. The assassins themselves were often just disposable tools in a larger economic machine. Chapter 7. Your targets and how to reach. Them medieval assassination targets weren't random victims picked for convenience. They were specific people whose deaths would serve political, religious, or economic purposes, and reaching them alive was a challenge that would test every skill you'd never properly learned. Your targets fell into several categories, each with their own unique challenges. Religious figures, bishops, abbots, influential priests were often targeted for their political activities or to send messages to church hierarchies. These targets were usually well-educated, suspicious by nature, and surrounded by loyal servants who knew how to spot trouble. Political figures, nobles, royal administrators, judges, were the most dangerous targets because they had the resources and authority to mount serious investigations if attempts against them failed. They also tended to have better security and more experience dealing with threats. Economic targets, wealthy merchants, guild leaders, moneylenders, might seem easier, but they were often paranoid about their wealth and safety. They employed guards, lived in well-fortified compounds, and had extensive networks of contacts who could provide warning of threats. Personal targets, rivals in love or business, family members in inheritance disputes, revenge killings, were sometimes the most challenging because the motives were obvious and the list of suspects was short. Reaching your target required detailed intelligence gathering, which was time-consuming and dangerous. You'd need to learn their daily routines, identify their associates, map their living and working spaces, and discover their vulnerabilities. This meant spending days or weeks observing them, talking to their servants and neighbors, and gradually building a picture of their lives. Medieval security wasn't sophisticated by modern standards, but it was effective within its context. Important people lived in defended compounds, castles, fortified manors, or well-guarded urban residences. They traveled with escorts, ate food prepared by trusted servants, and were generally suspicious of strangers. Getting close enough to strike required elaborate deception. You might pose as a traveling merchant, a religious pilgrim, a craftsman, or a servant. Each role required specific knowledge and skills you probably didn't possess. A fake merchant needed to know about trade, goods, routes, and prices. A false priest needed religious knowledge and the ability to perform convincing rituals. The most common approach was to infiltrate the target's household as a servant. This required finding someone willing to vouch for you, which usually meant bribes or blackmail. Once inside, you'd have to maintain your cover while looking for opportunities to complete your mission. This could take weeks or months, during which you'd be constantly at risk of discovery. Physical access was only part of the challenge. Medieval important people were rarely alone. They were surrounded by family, servants, guards, and visitors. Finding a moment when your target was vulnerable required patience, planning, and usually a significant amount of luck. The timing had to be perfect. Attack too early in your infiltration, and you'd be obvious suspect. Wait too long, and you risked discovery or having your target change their routine. The window of opportunity was usually narrow and might not come at all. Even if you successfully approached your target, the actual act of killing them was fraught with difficulties. Medieval people were generally tough, accustomed to violence, and quick to respond to threats. A botched assassination attempt would likely result in your immediate death at the hands of guards or bystanders. Chapter 8. The Art of Medieval Poison holds a special place in the mythology of assassination, painted as the subtle weapon of choice for sophisticated killers. The reality was far less elegant and infinitely more dangerous, primarily to you. Medieval poisoning was less science than gambling with death. The knowledge of toxicology was virtually non-existent. People understood that certain substances could kill, but they had no concept of dosage, absorption rates, or individual tolerance. What killed one person might barely affect another, and what seemed like a safe amount might prove fatal to the poisoner during preparation. The most commonly available toxic substances were plant-based. Hemlock was perhaps the most famous, made notorious by Socrates' execution, but identifying and preparing it correctly required botanical knowledge most people didn't possess. Wolfsbane, also called aconitine, was another option, but it was equally unreliable and dangerous to handle. Mushroom. Poisoning was an option for those with mycological knowledge, but again, this required expertise most assassins lacked. Deathcap mushrooms could indeed kill, but they took days to work, made the victim violently ill first, and were difficult to disguise in food. Heavy metal poisoning, primarily arsenic and mercury, was possible, but required access to these substances, which was difficult and expensive for most people. Arsenic was sometimes available as a rat poison, but it had a distinctive taste and color that made it hard to hide in food or drink. The delivery methods were limited and obvious. Putting poison in food required access to the target's kitchen or table, which meant infiltrating their household or bribing servants. Poisoning drink was easier, but still required getting close to the target at the right moment. The biggest problem with poisoning was its unreliability. Medieval people had different metabolisms, dietary habits, and tolerances than modern people. They were accustomed to eating partially spoiled food, which gave them some resistance to certain toxins. They also tended to eat in groups and share dishes, which meant multiple people might be affected, making the assassination obvious. Preparation of poisons was incredibly dangerous for the assassin. Handling toxic plants without proper protection often resulted in absorption through the skin. Many would-be poisoners killed themselves during the preparation process. Even successfully preparing a poison didn't guarantee it would work as intended. The timing of poisoning was also problematic. Some poisons worked quickly but were obvious, causing immediate symptoms that would identify the cause of death. Others worked slowly but gave the victim time to seek help or identify the poisoner. The medieval understanding of medicine was poor, but people could recognize poisoning symptoms and often had folk remedies that might prove effective. Detection wasn't impossible even in the Middle Ages. Certain poisons had distinctive smells, tastes, or effects that made them recognizable to experienced physicians or to people who had encountered them before. A suspicious death would often be investigated, and poison was always a possibility that authorities considered. Perhaps most importantly, poisoning required you to be close to your target at the time of administration, which made escape difficult. If the poison worked quickly, you'd be present when the victim died, making you an obvious suspect. If it worked slowly, you might have to maintain your cover for an extended period while the poison took effect. The romantic image of the poisoner as a sophisticated, subtle killer was largely fictional. In reality, poisoning was crude, unreliable, and extremely dangerous for everyone involved, especially the person attempting to use it. Chapter 9. Infiltration and disguise. The art of becoming someone else was perhaps the most crucial skill an assassin could possess, and it was infinitely Harder than Hollywood makes it look. Medieval society was structured in ways that made infiltration both necessary and nearly impossible. Medieval communities were small and tightly knit. Everyone knew everyone else, at least by sight. Strangers were noticed, questioned, and remembered. This meant that simply walking into a town or castle and blending in wasn't an option. You needed a credible identity, a believable story, and usually some form of introduction or recommendation. Creating a false identity required detailed knowledge of the role you were playing. If you posed as a traveling merchant, you needed to know about trade goods, routes, prices, and customs regulations. You had to carry appropriate samples or have convincing explanations for why you didn't. You needed to know the names of other merchants, the locations of markets, and the current state of various trade relationships. Religious disguises were popular because clergy moved freely between communities and were generally trusted. But posing as a priest, monk, or pilgrim required extensive religious knowledge. You'd need to know prayers, rituals, church hierarchy, and current religious controversies. Any mistake in Latin, errors in ritual, or ignorance of church politics would expose you immediately. Servant infiltration was often the most effective approach because servants were numerous, frequently changed, and not always well known to their employers. But getting hired as a servant required references from previous employers or community members. You'd need someone willing to vouch for you, which usually meant bribes, blackmail, or calling in favors from criminal contacts. The physical aspects of disguise were limited by available materials and techniques. There were no prosthetics, no advanced makeup, no convincing wigs. You might alter your hair color with plant dyes, change your beard style, or affect a limp or other physical mannerism. But dramatic physical transformation wasn't possible. Clothing was crucial for establishing identity, but appropriate clothing was expensive and difficult to obtain. Noble dress was regulated by sumptuary laws. It was literally illegal for common people to wear certain fabrics, colors, or styles. Wearing the wrong clothing could result in immediate arrest, even if you weren't suspected of being an assassin. Language and accent were major obstacles. Medieval Europe was linguistically fragmented. Even within the same country, people from different regions spoke with markedly different accents and used different local terms. Moving from one area to another and trying to pass as a local was extremely difficult because your speech would immediately mark you as an outsider. Maintaining your disguise over extended periods was physically and mentally exhausting. You had to constantly monitor your behavior, speech, and reactions to ensure they remained consistent with your assumed identity. Any slip could be fatal, so the psychological pressure was enormous. Social customs and knowledge were another challenge. Different social classes had different mannerisms, knowledge bases, and social expectations. A merchant was expected to know certain things and behave in certain ways that were different from those expected of a craftsman or a servant. Learning these distinctions well enough to be convincing required observation and practice most assassins didn't have time for. The consequences of discovery were severe. Being caught in a false identity wasn't just embarrassing, it was evidence of criminal intent. Even if you hadn't yet attempted your assassination, infiltration under false pretenses was itself a serious crime that could result in torture, imprisonment, or execution. Chapter 10. Medieval Security. Measures. Medieval security wasn't the primitive, ineffective system that modern people often imagine. Important people in the Middle Ages were well aware that they had enemies, and they took sophisticated precautions that would challenge even experienced assassins. Physical security started with architecture. Castles and fortified manors weren't just military installations. They were designed to control access and channel visitors through predictable routes where they could be observed and controlled. Multiple gates, narrow passages, and elevated positions for guards made unauthorized entry extremely difficult. Even urban residences of wealthy people were designed with security in mind. High walls, limited entrances, and internal courtyards created barriers to intrusion. Windows were small and often barred. Doors were heavy, reinforced, and secured with multiple locks. Personal protection was layered and constant. Important people rarely traveled alone or lived without guards. These weren't casual escorts. They were professional warriors whose job was to identify and neutralize threats. They were trained to watch for suspicious behavior, unusual objects, and anything out of the ordinary. Food security was taken seriously because poisoning was a known threat. Important people employed food tasters, servants whose job was to eat small portions of every dish before it was served. Kitchen staff were carefully selected and closely watched. Food preparation areas were restricted, and the chain of custody for food was carefully controlled. Intelligence networks provided advance warning of threats. Important people maintained networks of informants, servants in other households, merchants who traveled widely, clergy who heard confessions, and officials who dealt with the public. These networks could provide warning of assassination plots, identify suspicious strangers, and track the movements of potential threats. Guest procedures were formal and controlled. Visitors to castles or important households were expected to follow specific protocols. They were announced, searched, and often required to surrender weapons. Their movements within the residence were restricted and monitored. Unexpected or unannounced visitors were treated with extreme suspicion. Communication security was primitive but effective. Important messages were often coded or encrypted using simple substitution ciphers. Messengers were carefully selected for loyalty and were sometimes given partial information to prevent them from understanding the full content of their messages. Sleeping arrangements were carefully planned. Many important people slept in different rooms on different nights, used decoy bedrooms, or employed guards who stayed awake throughout the night. Bedroom doors were often barred from the inside, and windows were secured. Schedule randomization was common among those who understood security. Important people would vary their routines, change their travel routes, and alter their daily schedules to make planning attacks more difficult. They understood that predictability made them vulnerable. Legal security provided another layer of protection. Attacking important people carried severe penalties not just for the assassin, but for anyone who aided them. This meant that even criminals were often reluctant to get involved in assassination plots because the consequences for failure were so extreme. Religious and social protections were also significant. Many important people sought sanctuary in religious settings where attacking them would be sacrilege. They also cultivated relationships with other powerful people who would have interests in investigating and avenging their deaths. The combination of these security measures meant that successful assassination required extraordinary planning, skills, resources, and luck. The fact that political murders still occurred testifies to the determination of the people attempting them, not to the ineffectiveness of medieval security. Chapter 11. The Psychological Toll. What movies and books never show you is the crushing psychological weight of being a medieval assassin. The human mind isn't designed to handle the constant stress, isolation, and moral compromise that defined this existence. The first kill changed everything. Before that moment, you might have been a criminal, a desperate person, or even someone with justifiable grievances. But crossing the line from violence to murder fundamentally altered your relationship with the world and with yourself. Medieval people had different attitudes toward violence than modern people, but they still recognized murder as a profound transgression against divine and human law. Guilt and trauma were constant companions. Medieval Christianity taught that murder was one of the gravest sins, potentially damning your soul for eternity. Even if you didn't consider yourself particularly religious, these cultural beliefs shaped your worldview and self-perception. You'd carry the weight of knowing that you'd committed acts that your society considered fundamentally evil. Sleep became elusive. The combination of physical discomfort, constant vigilance, and psychological distress made restful sleep nearly impossible. When you did sleep, you'd be plagued by nightmares, reliving your killings, imagining your own death, or dreaming of the faces of your victims. Medieval people had no understanding of trauma-related sleep disorders, so these symptoms were often interpreted as divine punishment or demonic influence. Paranoia was both a survival skill and a mental health destroyer. You had to assume that everyone might be a threat, that every strange occurrence might signal danger, that every change in routine might herald your discovery. This level of constant suspicion was mentally exhausting and gradually eroded your ability to form normal human relationships or to trust your own perceptions. Isolation compounded every other psychological problem. Humans are social creatures who need connection, understanding, and acceptance from others. As an assassin, you were cut off from normal society and couldn't form genuine relationships because doing so would put both you and others at risk. This isolation created a feedback loop where psychological problems worsened because you had no support system to help manage them. Identity confusion was common among long-term assassins, constantly assuming false identities and maintaining elaborate deceptions made it difficult to maintain a stable sense of self. You might begin to lose track of who you really were beneath all the lies and personas. This wasn't just philosophical. It was a practical problem that made decision-making and planning more difficult. Moral dissociation was a coping mechanism that many assassins developed. To function despite the horrible things they'd done, they'd mentally separate their actions from their sense of self. They might tell themselves they were just following orders, serving a greater cause, or that their victims deserved to die. But this psychological protection came at the cost of emotional numbing and difficulty maintaining normal moral judgments. Physical symptoms of psychological distress were common: chronic headaches, digestive problems, muscle tension, and other stress-related ailments would plague you constantly. Medieval medicine had no understanding of psychosomatic illness, so these symptoms would likely be treated as spiritual or supernatural afflictions. Substance abuse was often the only available form of self-medication. Alcohol was cheap and readily available, and it temporarily numbed both physical and emotional pain. Many assassins became dependent on drink to cope with their daily existence, which further compromised their effectiveness and survival chances. Suicidal ideation was probably common, though it wasn't understood or documented in medieval terms. The combination of guilt, trauma, isolation, and hopelessness that defined the assassin's existence would naturally lead many to consider ending their own lives. Some may have deliberately taken unnecessary risks or provoked confrontations as a form of indirect suicide. The long-term psychological prognosis for medieval assassins was universally poor. Even those who managed to retire from the profession would carry lifelong trauma, trust issues, and social difficulties. They'd spent years training themselves to be suspicious, isolated, and prepared for violence, and these adaptations couldn't be easily undone. Chapter 12. Methods and techniques. The actual methods used by medieval assassins were far less sophisticated and much more brutal than popular culture suggests. Without advanced technology or specialized training, assassins had to rely on crude but effective techniques that prioritized simplicity over elegance. Stabbing was the most common method because it required minimal skill and equipment. The key was to strike quickly and accurately at vital points, the heart, throat, or major blood vessels. But medieval anatomy knowledge was limited, and many assassinations failed because the assassin struck the wrong spot or didn't penetrate deeply enough. Ribs could deflect blades, thick clothing could reduce penetration, and even mortal wounds might not cause immediate death, giving the victim time to cry out or fight back. Strangulation was favored for its silence. A thin cord, wire, or even bare hands could cut off air or blood flow to the brain. But strangulation required getting close behind the victim and maintaining pressure for an extended period. It was physically demanding and left you vulnerable if the victim fought back or if others arrived. Many strangulation attempts failed because the assassin lacked the strength or technique to maintain effective pressure. Throat cutting was quick and usually fatal, but it was messy and required precise timing. The victim had to be surprised and controlled, usually by grabbing them from behind and drawing the blade across the throat in a single motion. But this technique often resulted in blood spurting over the assassin, making escape more difficult because the evidence was literally all over you. Poisoning, as discussed earlier, was unreliable and dangerous. When it worked, it usually caused obvious symptoms that made the cause of death apparent. When it didn't work, it often just made the victim ill and suspicious. Most successful poisonings were probably accidental overdoses, rather than carefully calculated murders. Staged accidents were sometimes attempted, but were difficult to execute convincingly. Pushing someone downstairs, arranging for them to fall from heights, or creating situations where they might drown required extensive preparation and favorable circumstances. These methods also relied heavily on luck and were easily exposed if investigated thoroughly. Arson was occasionally used, particularly against targets who lived in wooden structures. Setting fires was relatively easy, but ensuring that the intended victim died while others escaped required careful timing and knowledge of the building's layout. Fire was also dangerous to the assassin and often spread beyond the intended target. Ambush attacks were common because they allowed the assassin to choose the time and place of the encounter. Waiting in an alley, hiding in the victim's residence, or attacking during travel were all variations of this approach. But ambushes required detailed knowledge of the victim's movements and often involved long periods of waiting in uncomfortable and exposed positions. Group attacks were sometimes used against particularly well-protected targets. Multiple assassins could overwhelm guards and ensure the target was killed, even if some of the attackers were stopped. But coordinating group attacks was difficult, increased the chances of discovery, and multiplied the number of people who might betray the plot. Weapon improvisation was necessary when specialized tools weren't available. Common objects like hammers, axes, kitchen knives, or even heavy objects could be turned into weapons. But improvised weapons were often awkward to use and might not be effective against determined or armored opponents. The timing of attacks was crucial regardless of the method used. Assassins had to balance the need for surprise with the requirement for effective escape routes. Attacking too early might miss the opportunity. Waiting too long might result in discovery or changed circumstances. Most successful medieval assassinations shared certain characteristics. They were simple rather than elaborate. They took advantage of the victim's vulnerabilities rather than trying to overcome their strengths, and they prioritized effectiveness over elegance. The assassins who survived longest were those who kept their methods straightforward and focused on execution rather than innovation. Chapter 13. Escape and Evasion. Successfully killing your target was only half the challenge. Getting away alive was often more difficult than the assassination itself. Medieval escape and evasion required careful planning, local knowledge, and considerable luck. Immediate escape was the most critical phase. Within minutes of completing your mission, the alarm would be raised, guards would be mobilized, and systematic searches would begin. Your window for getting out of the immediate area was measured in minutes, not hours. This meant you had to have your escape route planned in detail before you ever attempted the assassination. Urban escapes offered certain advantages. Cities had multiple exits, complex street layouts, and crowds that could provide concealment. But city gates were controlled and could be closed quickly. Streets were patrolled, and the urban population included many people who might recognize strangers or suspicious behavior. You'd need to balance speed with stealth, moving quickly enough to get away, but not so fast as to attract attention. Rural escapes presented different challenges. The countryside offered more places to hide and fewer people to spot you, but it also had fewer exit routes and escape options. Rural communities were tightly knit and strangers were more noticeable. Traveling across open country was slow and left you exposed to pursuit. Weather and terrain could make travel difficult or impossible. River and coastal escapes were preferred when available because pursuit was more difficult over water. Having a boat waiting or being able to commandeer one could provide crucial advantages, but water travel required skills many assassins didn't possess, and boats were expensive and conspicuous resources that had to be arranged in advance. Disguise changes were essential during escape. The clothes you wore during the assassination had to be discarded or altered as quickly as possible. Ideally, you'd have different clothing cached along your escape route, allowing you to change your appearance multiple times. But acquiring and placing these resources required advanced planning and additional expenses. Safe houses were crucial for extended escapes. These were predetermined locations where you could hide, rest, and plan your next moves. They might be rented rooms, abandoned buildings, or houses belonging to criminal contacts. But safe houses were vulnerable to discovery and represented ongoing security risks because other people knew about them. False identities became even more important during escape. You needed convincing cover stories for why you were traveling, where you were going, and what your business was. These identities had to be backed up with appropriate documentation, clothing, and knowledge. Maintaining false identities under the stress of escape was mentally demanding and error-prone. Pursuit techniques used by medieval authorities were more sophisticated than you might expect. Professional trackers could follow footprints, identify your route and predict your likely destinations. Mounted pursuers could cover ground much faster than you could on foot. Networks of officials and informants could provide intelligence about your movements across wide areas. Counter-tracking techniques were essential skills that most assassins learned through necessity. These included walking on hard surfaces to avoid leaving prints, using streams to break scent trails, taking indirect routes to confuse followers, and using decoy tactics to misdirect pursuit. But effective counter-tracking required skills and knowledge that took time to develop. Long distance. Escape required different strategies than immediate flight. Once you were clear of the immediate search area, you needed to put maximum distance between yourself and the crime scene while avoiding the major routes that would be watched. This often meant traveling through difficult terrain, avoiding main roads, and moving primarily at night. Resource management during escape was critical. You needed money for food, lodging, and bribes, but carrying too much wealth made you a target for bandits. You needed weapons for protection, but couldn't appear too heavily armed. You needed supplies for travel, but couldn't carry so much that you appeared suspicious or were slowed down. Communication during escape was limited and dangerous. You couldn't send messages to Confederates or employers because doing so would create evidence and reveal your location. You had to assume that all your previous contacts were compromised and that using any of them would lead to your capture. The psychological pressure of escape was enormous. The adrenaline crash after the assassination would leave you exhausted and emotionally unstable. The knowledge that you were being actively hunted would create constant stress and fear. Decision-making would be impaired by fatigue, stress, and the knowledge that any mistake could be fatal. Most medieval assassins were caught during their escape attempts rather than during the actual assassination. The skills required for successful escape, planning, resource management, physical endurance, psychological resilience, and technical knowledge were different from those needed for killing and often more demanding. Chapter 14. The law and justice system. Medieval justice was swift, brutal, and absolutely unforgiving when it came to assassination. If caught, you wouldn't face a modern trial with lawyers, appeals, and due process. You'd face a system designed to extract confessions through pain and to make your death a public spectacle that would deter others from following your path. Legal protections for accused criminals were virtually non-existent. The concept of innocent until proven guilty didn't exist in medieval jurisprudence. If you were arrested for assassination, the assumption was that you were guilty, and the purpose of legal proceedings was to confirm that guilt and determine the appropriate punishment, not to establish your innocence. Investigation techniques were primitive but could be effective. Medieval authorities relied heavily on witness testimony, physical evidence like weapons or blood-stained clothing, and confessions obtained through interrogation. They also used informants, offered rewards for information, and employed local knowledge of suspects and their associates. Torture was a standard investigative tool. Medieval legal systems considered torture not only acceptable, but necessary for obtaining reliable confessions from criminals. The torture wouldn't be random brutality. It was systematic, designed to break your will while keeping you alive long enough to provide useful information. Common torture methods included the rack, which stretched your body until joints dislocated, the strappado, which suspended you by your arms tied behind your back, and various forms of crushing devices that applied pressure to specific body parts. These weren't crude instruments. They were precisely engineered tools designed to cause maximum pain while avoiding fatal injury. The information authorities wanted wasn't just confirmation of your guilt. They wanted to know who hired you, who helped you, how you planned the assassination, and what other plots might be in motion. They'd continue torturing you until they were satisfied they had complete information, which often meant until you died from the torture or told them everything they wanted to hear, whether it was true or not. Trial procedures were brief and predetermined. If you survived the interrogation phase, you might face a formal trial, but this was more of a sentencing hearing than an investigation of facts. Judges had usually already decided your guilt based on the confession obtained through torture. The trial was a formality required by legal procedure, not a genuine examination of evidence. Legal representation wasn't available. You'd face the proceedings alone, without advocacy or assistance. Medieval law didn't recognize a right to counsel, and lawyers were rare and expensive professionals who worked for wealthy clients, not accused. Criminals. Sentencing reflected the severity of assassination as a crime. Murder was considered one of the most serious offenses in medieval law, and political murder was even worse because it threatened social order and royal authority. Death was the standard sentence, but the method of execution would reflect the aggravating circumstances of your crime. Execution methods for assassins were designed to be both painful and public. Hanging was the standard method for common criminals, but assassins might face more elaborate punishments. Drawing and quartering involved being dragged through the streets, hanged until nearly dead, disemboweled while still alive, and then cut into pieces. Burning alive was used for crimes considered particularly heinous or heretical. Public execution served multiple purposes beyond punishment. It demonstrated royal power and justice, provided entertainment for the populace, and created a deterrent effect for potential criminals. Your death would be turned into a public spectacle, designed to reinforce social order and discourage others from following your path. Appeals processes didn't exist in any meaningful sense. Once sentenced, you might petition for mercy, but this was rarely granted for serious crimes like assassination. Royal pardons were possible, but were usually reserved for political considerations that had nothing to do with your guilt or innocence. Imprisonment wasn't generally used as punishment in medieval times. Prisons were holding facilities where people waited for trial or execution, not places where criminals served sentences. Long-term imprisonment was expensive and served no purpose that authorities recognized. If you weren't executed, you might be sentenced to mutilation, exile, or forced servitude, but not imprisonment. The speed of medieval justice meant that from arrest to execution might be a matter of days or weeks, not months or years. This quick pace was partly practical. Maintaining prisoners was expensive and partly philosophical. Medieval people believed that swift punishment was more effective as a deterrent and more satisfying to victims' families and the community. Chapter 15. The Original Assassins. Historical context. To understand why you wouldn't have survived as a medieval assassin, it's crucial to examine the historical group that gave the profession its name. The Nizari Ismailis, known to their enemies as the Hashishin, or assassins. The Nizari Ismailis emerged in the late 11th century as a Shia Muslim sect in a world dominated by Sunni Muslim powers and Christian Crusader states. Led by Hassan-i Sabbah, they established a network of mountain fortresses throughout Persia and Syria, with their most famous stronghold at Alamut in northern Iran. These weren't random murderers or hired killers. They were a religious and political movement with sophisticated organizational structure, clear ideological goals, and remarkable strategic vision. Their use of targeted political assassination was a calculated response to their military weakness. They couldn't field armies large enough to challenge the great powers of their time, So they developed asymmetric warfare tactics that maximized their limited resources. The training and indoctrination of Nizari assassins was far more extensive than anything available to freelance killers. Young men were recruited from among the faithful, educated in religious doctrine, trained in languages and cultural practices of their targets, and prepared psychologically for martyrdom missions. This wasn't casual recruitment of desperate criminals. It was systematic development of ideologically motivated operatives. Their intelligence network was sophisticated by medieval standards. The Nizari maintained agents throughout the Middle East who provided information about targets, political developments, and opportunities for action. They had people placed in courts, armies, and religious institutions who could gather intelligence and provide access when needed. The legendary paradise of Alamut, where recruits were supposedly drugged and shown a false paradise to motivate them for suicide missions, was likely propaganda created by their enemies. Medieval Islamic sources don't support these stories, which appear to have been Christian and Sunni Muslim attempts to discredit the Nizari by suggesting their followers were deceived rather than genuinely committed. The actual methods used by Nizari assassins were more sophisticated than those available to common criminals. They typically spent months or years infiltrating their targets' organizations, building trust, and gaining access. Their assassinations were usually carried out in public, often during religious ceremonies or state functions. And the assassins made no attempt to escape because martyrdom was part of their mission. The political impact of Nizari assassinations was precisely calculated. They targeted specific individuals whose deaths would advance their strategic goals: Sunni religious leaders who opposed them, military commanders who threatened their territories, and political figures who represented obstacles to their survival. Each assassination was a carefully planned political statement, not a random act of violence. Their defensive capabilities were as impressive as their offensive operations. The mountain fortresses were nearly impregnable, supplied by sophisticated agricultural and water management systems, and defended by troops who were motivated by religious conviction as well as military training. These strongholds allowed the Nizari to survive for nearly 2 centuries, despite constant pressure from much larger powers. The organizational structure of the Nizari was hierarchical and disciplined. Leadership was provided by educated religious scholars who combined spiritual authority with political and military expertise. The rank-and-file members were indoctrinated, but not mindless. They understood their missions and were capable of independent action when circumstances required it. Their downfall came not from the ineffectiveness of their methods, but from overwhelming military force. The Mongol invasions of the 13th century brought armies large enough to systematically reduce their fortresses and efficient enough to maintain long sieges. Even then, it took decades to completely eliminate the Nizari strongholds. The legend of the assassins that developed in European sources was heavily distorted by cultural misunderstanding and political propaganda. Christian chroniclers of the Crusades often exaggerated the threat posed by the Nizari and misrepresented their methods and motivations. These distorted accounts became the basis for the romantic image of the assassin that persists in popular culture. The historical Nizari Ismailis succeeded because they had resources, organization, training, and ideological motivation that individual assassins could never possess. Their example actually demonstrates why freelance medieval assassins were so likely to fail. They lacked every advantage that made the Nizari effective. Chapter 16. Tools of the Trade, Weapons and Equipment. The romantic image of the medieval assassin armed with exotic weapons and sophisticated gadgets is pure fantasy. Real assassins worked with whatever they could acquire, afford, or steal, and their equipment was uniformly crude, unreliable, and inadequate for the enormous challenges they faced. Knives were the primary weapon, because they were common, cheap, and easy to conceal. But the quality available to most assassins was abysmal. Iron was the standard material, not steel, and even iron blades were often poorly forged, inadequately tempered, and prone to breaking under stress. A blade that seemed adequate for eating or utility work might shatter when striking bone or meeting resistance. Edge retention was a constant problem. Medieval metallurgy produced blades that dulled quickly and were difficult to sharpen without proper tools. A knife that was sharp enough to be effective as a weapon might become too dull to cut rope within days of use. Maintaining weapons required skills and equipment most assassins didn't possess. Concealability versus effectiveness was a fundamental trade-off. Larger blades were more effective as weapons, but harder to hide. Smaller blades were easier to conceal, but less likely to cause fatal wounds quickly. Medieval clothing didn't have the pockets and compartments that would make concealment easy, so weapons had to be hidden in boots, sewn into clothing, or carried in ways that made quick access difficult. Improvised weapons were common because purpose-made weapons were expensive and conspicuous. Eating knives, farming tools, craft implements, and common household objects could all serve as weapons in desperate circumstances. But improvised weapons were usually poorly balanced, awkward to use, and ineffective against determined opposition. Crossbows were occasionally used by assassins because they could kill at range and were more accurate than bows, but crossbows were expensive, time-consuming to reload, and conspicuous to carry. They also required skill to use effectively and were useless once the first shot was fired. Most importantly, owning a crossbow without proper authorization was often illegal and would mark you as a potential threat. Garrotes and strangling cords were favored by some assassins because they were silent and easy to conceal. A simple cord or thin rope could be devastating in the right circumstances, but strangulation required getting close behind the victim, maintaining pressure for an extended period, and overcoming their struggles. It was also physically demanding and left the assassin vulnerable if others arrived. Poison equipment, when available, was primitive and dangerous. Preparing, storing, and administering poisons required containers, measuring devices, and knowledge that most assassins lacked. The vessels used to hold poisons were often as dangerous to the assassin as to the intended victim, and contamination was a constant risk. Lockpicking tools existed, but were rare and required skills most people didn't possess. Simple metal picks and tension tools could defeat basic medieval locks, but acquiring these tools marked you as a professional criminal. Most breaking and entering was accomplished through unlocked doors, bribed servants, or brute force, rather than sophisticated lock manipulation. Climbing equipment was occasionally useful for accessing upper floors or escaping over walls. Ropes, grappling hooks, and improvised ladders could provide access to otherwise secure locations. But this equipment was heavy, conspicuous, and required physical skills that many assassins hadn't developed. Disguise materials were limited by available technology and resources. False beards, hair dyes made from plant materials, and makeup created from available pigments could alter appearance to some degree. But these disguises were crude and wouldn't withstand close examination. Most disguise work relied on changes in clothing, posture, and behavior rather than actual alterations to physical appearance. Armor was generally beyond the means of most assassins and would have been counterproductive anyway. Real armor was extremely expensive and would make stealth impossible. At most, an assassin might wear a thick leather vest or padded clothing for minimal protection, but this offered little defense against serious weapons. Communication equipment didn't exist in any meaningful sense. Assassins had no way to coordinate with Confederates, call for help, or transmit information quickly over distances. Everything had to be planned in advance, and there was no way to adapt to changing circumstances once operations began. The total value of a typical assassin's equipment might have been equivalent to a few days' wages for a skilled craftsman. Compare this to a knight's equipment, which could be worth more than a small farm, and you begin to understand how poorly equipped assassins really were for the enormous challenges they faced. Chapter 17. Social networks and criminal organizations, medieval. Assassins didn't operate in complete isolation, but the criminal networks available to them were unreliable, dangerous, and often more threat than assistance. Understanding these relationships is crucial to grasping why the assassin's life was so precarious. Urban criminal networks existed in every major medieval city, but they were loose associations rather than organized crime families. These networks included thieves, smugglers, corrupt officials, dishonest merchants, and various other criminals who shared information and occasionally cooperated on ventures. But trust was minimal, loyalty was purchased rather than earned, and betrayal was. Common thieves' guilds, despite their romantic reputation, were rarely the sophisticated organizations depicted in fiction. Most were informal groups that controlled certain territories or types of crime, enforced through violence and intimidation rather than formal authority. An assassin might find temporary allies among these groups, but they'd also be seen as competition or a potential threat. Corrupt officials were perhaps the most valuable contacts an assassin could develop. Guards who could be bribed to look the other way, administrators who would alter records, or judges who could be influenced were invaluable resources. But cultivating these relationships required money, patience, and significant risk. Officials who took bribes were paranoid about exposure and often eliminated criminal contacts who became inconvenient. Religious networks sometimes provided assistance to assassins, particularly when the killings served political or ideological purposes. Corrupt clergy might provide sanctuary, false documentation, or intelligence about targets, but medieval religious institutions were generally opposed to murder on moral grounds. So finding clerical assistance required careful identification of individuals whose principles could be compromised. Merchant networks were useful for travel and communication. Legitimate merchants often turned a blind eye to criminal activities in exchange for protection or additional profits. They could provide cover identities for travel, carry messages, or transport weapons and equipment. But merchants were business people first, and they wouldn't jeopardize their operations for criminal associates unless the benefits clearly outweighed the risks. Mercenary companies sometimes harbored assassins or provided training in violence. Disbanded soldiers often drifted into criminal activities, and their military experience made them valuable for certain types of operations. But mercenaries were generally more interested in open warfare than covert assassination, and their loyalty was entirely dependent on payment. Intelligence networks were crucial for successful assassinations, but were expensive and difficult to maintain. Servants in target households, officials with access to schedules and security information, and observers who could track movements and routines were all necessary resources. But developing these networks required time, money, and considerable skill in human manipulation. Safe house networks provided temporary shelter and resources for assassins on the run. These might be criminal associates, sympathetic individuals, or people who could be bribed or blackmailed into providing assistance. But safe houses were vulnerable to discovery and represented ongoing security risks. The people who provided them usually demanded ongoing payment or favors. Communication networks allowed assassins to maintain contact with employers and confederates over distances. Merchants, pilgrims, clergy, and other travelers could carry messages. But this required finding trustworthy intermediaries and accepting the risks that came with written communication. Messages could be intercepted, intermediaries could be compromised, and written evidence could be used against you. Professional networks among criminals were limited but important. Experienced assassins might mentor newcomers, though this was rare because it increased risk without providing clear benefits. Criminal specialists like forgers, poisoners, or infiltration experts might collaborate on complex operations, but these relationships were usually temporary and focused on specific jobs. Law enforcement networks were more sophisticated than most criminals realized. Medieval authorities maintained informant networks among criminals, offering reduced sentences or financial rewards for information. These networks meant that any criminal association could potentially be penetrated by law enforcement, making trust dangerous and paranoia essential. The economics of criminal networks were always precarious. Everyone involved needed money to survive, but criminal activities were unreliable sources of income. This created constant tension between associates who might compete for opportunities or who might be tempted to betray each other for short-term gain. Geographic limitations restricted the effectiveness of criminal networks. Most operated within limited areas, where personal relationships could be maintained. Moving beyond these areas meant leaving your support network behind and trying to establish new relationships in unfamiliar territory where your reputation and connections were unknown. The loyalty within criminal networks was always conditional and temporary. Criminals associated with each other for mutual benefit, but they'd abandon or betray associates whenever it served their interests. An assassin who relied too heavily on criminal networks was likely to be betrayed by them eventually. Chapter 18. The Client Relationship. The relationship between an assassin and their client was perhaps the most dangerous aspect of the entire profession. These weren't business partnerships between equals. They were exploitative arrangements where the client held all the power and the assassin accepted all the risk. Finding clients was the first challenge. Legitimate people didn't advertise their need for assassination services, and assassins couldn't openly market their capabilities. The connection usually happened through criminal intermediaries who knew both parties and could facilitate introductions. But these intermediaries often took substantial fees and represented additional security risks. Initial contact was always indirect and carefully obscured. Clients rarely met assassins face-to-face during early negotiations. Instead, they used intermediaries, coded messages, or elaborate procedures designed to maintain their anonymity while evaluating the assassin's capabilities and reliability. This asymmetric relationship meant the client learned about the assassin while revealing nothing about themselves. Payment negotiations were heavily weighted in favor of clients. They set the prices, determined payment schedules, and could walk away from negotiations at any time. Assassins had limited ability to bargain because they were usually desperate for money and had few alternative opportunities. Clients could easily find other assassins, but assassins couldn't easily find other clients. Advance payments were typically minimal. Clients understood that paying too much upfront reduced their leverage over the assassin and increased their financial risk if the job failed. Most payment arrangements called for small advance payments with the majority due upon completion. This meant assassins had to fund most of their expenses from their own resources. Trust issues plagued every client relationship. Clients had to trust that assassins would complete their jobs without being caught, without revealing client identities, and without attempting blackmail afterward. Assassins had to trust that clients would pay as promised and wouldn't eliminate them after the job was completed. Neither side could afford to trust the other completely. Contract terms were usually vague and unenforceable. There were no legal remedies for breach of assassination contracts, so everything depended on informal understandings that could be interpreted differently by each party. Disputes over payment, scope of work, or completion criteria couldn't be resolved through normal commercial channels. Client motivations varied, but were always personal and often irrational. Political rivals, business competitors, romantic rivals, family disputes, and personal vendettas all generated assassination contracts. But clients weren't always thinking clearly when they commissioned murders, and their motivations might change between the initial contract and the completion of the job. Identity protection was asymmetric. Clients went to great lengths to conceal their identities from assassins, but they often knew exactly who they were hiring. This meant clients could eliminate assassins if necessary, but assassins had limited ability to retaliate against clients who betrayed them. Scope creep was common in assassination contracts. Clients often expanded their requirements after initial agreements were reached, asking for additional targets, specific methods, or timing changes that increased the assassin's risk without proportional increases in payment. Assassins had little leverage to resist these changes once they'd committed to the basic contract. Intelligence support from clients was usually inadequate. Clients often overestimated their knowledge of targets and underestimated the complexity of assassination operations. They'd provide incomplete or inaccurate information about security, schedules, and access, leaving assassins to fill in crucial gaps through their own research. Post-job relationships were the most dangerous phase. Once the assassination was completed, Clients had strong incentives to eliminate the assassin to prevent future blackmail or exposure. Many assassination contracts were followed by secondary contracts targeting the original assassin. The people most likely to kill you were the ones who'd hired you. Legal liability was entirely on the assassin. If operations failed and investigations began, clients could credibly deny involvement while assassins faced torture and execution. The legal system recognized no shared responsibility between clients and assassins. Hiring a killer was a crime, but being the killer was a much worse crime with much worse punishments. Repeat business was rare because successful assassins usually died or disappeared, and unsuccessful ones were eliminated by law enforcement or their own clients. The few assassins who developed ongoing client relationships found themselves increasingly dependent on those clients and vulnerable to their changing whims and requirements. Quality control was impossible to enforce. Clients couldn't complain to authorities if assassins failed to perform adequately, and assassins couldn't seek legal remedies if clients failed to pay. Everything depended on reputation and informal enforcement through criminal networks, which were unreliable and often corrupt. Chapter 19: Regional Variations and Cultural Differences. Medieval assassination varied significantly across different regions and cultures, each presenting unique challenges that would have made survival even more difficult for foreign assassins operating outside their native areas. Byzantine assassination culture was sophisticated and politically motivated. The Eastern Roman Empire had a long tradition of palace intrigue and political murder that was more systematic than in Western Europe. Byzantine assassins often worked within complex court hierarchies and needed to understand elaborate ceremonial procedures, religious protocols, and family relationships that took years to master. Islamic assassination, exemplified by the Nizari, Ismailis, operated within different legal and religious frameworks than Christian assassination. Islamic law had specific provisions regarding political violence, martyrdom, and religious justification for killing. An assassin operating in Islamic territories needed to understand these principles and their local interpretations to avoid making fatal cultural mistakes. Italian city-state assassination was driven by commercial and political competition between merchant families and political factions. Italian assassins needed to understand complex business relationships, family alliances, and trade networks that could shift rapidly. The urban environment provided different opportunities and challenges than the rural settings common in other regions. French assassination was influenced by the centralized royal court and feudal obligations that created specific vulnerabilities and protections for targets. Understanding the French court's elaborate etiquette, the relationships between royal officials, and the system of royal justice was essential for operating in French territories. English assassination occurred within a system of common law and royal authority that differed significantly from continental European practices. English legal procedures, investigation methods, and punishment systems created different risks and opportunities for assassins. The English also had different approaches to personal security and different cultural attitudes toward violence. German assassination was complicated by the fragmented political structure of the Holy Roman Empire. The relationships between emperors, princes, bishops, and city authorities created complex jurisdictional issues that could be advantageous or dangerous depending on the specific circumstances. German cultural attitudes toward honor and violence also differed from those in other regions. Scandinavian assassination operated within warrior cultures that had different concepts of honorable killing and personal revenge. Norse legal traditions, family obligations, and social structures created different contexts for political violence than those found in more urbanized or centralized regions. Eastern European assassination involved different religious traditions, political structures, and cultural practices than Western European assassination. Orthodox Christianity had different attitudes toward violence and political authority than Roman Catholicism. Slavic legal traditions and social organizations created different opportunities and risks for assassins. Rural versus urban assassination presented completely different challenges regardless of the region. Rural areas offered more hiding places, but had tighter social networks where strangers were more noticeable. Urban areas provided more anonymity, but had better law enforcement and more sophisticated security measures. Seasonal variations affected assassination operations differently in different climates and regions. Northern regions had longer winters that limited travel and changed security patterns. Mediterranean regions had different agricultural cycles and social rhythms that affected target accessibility and escape opportunities. Language barriers were enormous obstacles for assassins, operating outside their native regions. Medieval Europe was linguistically fragmented, with multiple languages and dialects often spoken within the same political territory. Accent and vocabulary could immediately identify someone as foreign, making infiltration extremely difficult. Religious differences created additional complications. An assassin from a Catholic region operating in Orthodox territory, or vice versa, would face challenges in understanding religious practices, recognizing religious authorities, and blending in during religious observances. Even within the same general religious tradition, local practices varied significantly. Legal traditions differed dramatically between regions, affecting everything from investigation procedures to punishment methods. What might be considered adequate evidence in one region could be insufficient in another. Understanding local legal customs was essential for planning operations and escapes. Economic systems varied between regions, affecting everything from currency to commercial practices. An assassin needed to understand local economic relationships, trading practices, and financial systems to operate effectively. Misunderstanding these could lead to exposure or failure to complete missions. Social hierarchies and class relationships differed between regions and could trap foreign assassins who misunderstood local customs. Behavior that was acceptable in one region might be suspicious or offensive in another. Understanding these subtleties required cultural knowledge that took years to acquire. Military traditions and security practices reflected local history and culture. Some regions had more sophisticated security measures based on their experience with political violence. Others had different approaches to personal protection that reflected their military traditions and cultural values. The combination of these regional variations meant that an assassin operating outside their native area faced enormous additional challenges beyond those already inherent in the profession. Most successful medieval assassins operated within limited geographic areas, where they understood the local culture, language, and customs. Chapter 20. The Endgame. Why you wouldn't last. After examining every aspect of medieval assassination, the conclusion is inescapable. You wouldn't have lasted a day, not because you lack courage or intelligence, but because the profession was designed to consume its practitioners. Physical demands alone would have broken most modern people. Medieval life was harsh even for legitimate citizens, but assassins faced additional challenges that would quickly overwhelm anyone accustomed to modern comfort and safety. Sleeping rough, eating spoiled food, walking vast distances on poor roads, and enduring constant physical discomfort were just the baseline. Requirements for survival. The skill requirements were beyond what any individual could realistically master. Successful assassination required expertise in weapons, infiltration, escape and evasion, social manipulation, regional politics, cultural customs, and dozens of other specialized areas. Even if you somehow acquired these skills, maintaining them while living the life of a fugitive would have been nearly impossible. Economic realities made long-term survival unlikely. The pay was inadequate for the risks involved, expenses consumed most earnings, and steady income was impossible to maintain. Most assassins probably died of starvation, disease, or exposure long before they were caught and executed. The profession offered no path to financial security or comfortable retirement. Psychological pressures would have destroyed your mental health within weeks. The combination of isolation, constant fear, moral compromise, and physical hardship created psychological conditions that would drive most people to breakdown or suicide. Medieval people had different mental frameworks than modern people, but they weren't immune to trauma and despair. Social isolation was both a survival requirement and a guarantee of psychological destruction. Humans need social connections to maintain mental health, but assassins couldn't afford genuine relationships. The loneliness and alienation would have been crushing, and there were no support systems available to help manage these pressures. Legal consequences were swift and brutal. Medieval justice systems were specifically designed to make assassination unprofitable and terrifying. The torture, public execution, and posthumous humiliation waiting for captured assassins would deter most rational people from ever attempting the profession. Technical limitations of medieval technology made assassination much more difficult than modern people realize. Without modern weapons, communication systems, transportation, or medical care, assassins were working with Stone Age tools to accomplish tasks that challenge even modern special operations forces. Cultural barriers would have been insurmountable for most people. Understanding medieval social systems, religious practices, economic relationships, and political structures well enough to operate effectively required knowledge that took decades to acquire. Modern people would make fatal cultural mistakes. Within hours of beginning operations, training and support systems didn't exist for independent assassins. Unlike the historical Nizari Ismailis, who had extensive organizational support, resources, and training, freelance assassins were entirely on their own. They had to develop all necessary skills through trial and error, while being actively hunted by law enforcement. The success rate was abysmal. Most assassination attempts failed, and most assassins died in the attempt or shortly afterward. Even successful assassins rarely survived long enough to enjoy their profits or develop sustainable careers. The profession had no learning curve, because failure was usually fatal. Competition was deadly. Other criminals, law enforcement, clients, and even fellow assassins represented constant threats. The medieval world was violent enough without adding professional murder to your list of problems. Every relationship was potentially dangerous, and every interaction carried risks of exposure or betrayal. Resource limitations made every operation a logistical nightmare. Assassins lacked money for proper equipment, intelligence gathering, or operational support. They had to improvise constantly, relying on luck and desperation, rather than proper planning and resources. Geographic constraints limited operational range and escape options. Medieval transportation was slow, expensive, and dangerous. And assassins' operational area was usually limited to regions where they understood the culture and had some form of support network. This made them vulnerable to systematic searches and increased the likelihood of eventual capture. Intelligence gaps left assassins operating blindly. They rarely had adequate information about their targets, security measures, or political context. Operating without proper intelligence meant making decisions based on incomplete information, which usually led to failure. Medical realities meant that any serious injury was likely to be fatal. Medieval medicine couldn't treat traumatic injuries effectively, and assassins couldn't seek medical help without risking exposure. Even minor wounds could become infected and kill you slowly and painfully. The historical record supports this grim assessment. We know about medieval assassination primarily from accounts of failures, captured assassins, and political consequences. The successful assassins who managed to escape and survive left few records because anonymity was essential for survival. Modern special operations forces, despite having advanced training, equipment, support systems, and legal protection, still find assassination operations extremely challenging and dangerous. Medieval assassins lacked every advantage that modern professionals take for granted, yet faced the same fundamental challenges, plus many additional obstacles. The romantic image of the medieval assassin is pure fantasy created by modern entertainment, media. The reality was a short, brutal existence that ended badly for virtually everyone who attempted it. The profession attracted desperate people and made them more desperate, creating a downward spiral that ended in death, capture, or madness even. If you somehow managed to survive your first few operations, the long-term prognosis was hopeless. The skills required for assassination were incompatible with normal life. The psychological damage was irreversible. The criminal connections were permanent liabilities. And the enemies you made would never stop hunting you. The few assassins who might have survived long enough to attempt retirement would have faced ongoing threats from former clients, criminal associates, law enforcement, and the families of their victims. There was no statute of limitations on murder, no witness protection program, and no way to legitimately rebuild your life. In the end, medieval assassination wasn't a profession. It was a particularly elaborate and expensive form of suicide. The only question was whether you'd die quickly from violence or slowly from the grinding pressures of a life that no human being could sustain. Chapter 21: Medieval Medicine and the Assassin's Body. Let's talk about something that would have killed you faster than any sword or rope: your own body's inevitable breakdown in a world without modern medicine. Being a medieval assassin meant living with pain, disease, and injury in ways that would horrify modern people. Dental problems alone would have been agony. Medieval people had terrible teeth due to coarse bread that contained stone particles from grinding, limited dental care, and diets high in honey and dried fruits when available. As an assassin, your dental problems would be worse because stress, poor nutrition, and inability to seek proper care would accelerate decay. Tooth infections were common and often fatal because they could spread to your brain or heart. Imagine trying to infiltrate a noble's household while suffering from an abscessed tooth. The constant throbbing pain would affect your judgment, your ability to maintain disguises, and your capacity for careful planning. Medieval dental extraction was performed without anesthesia using crude tools, and the procedures often killed patients through shock or infection. Parasitic infections were virtually universal in medieval times. Intestinal worms, lice, fleas, and mites would be your constant companions. These parasites caused malnutrition, anemia, and constant discomfort. The itching from flea and lice bites would be maddening, and scratching would create open wounds that could become infected. Intestinal parasites were particularly debilitating. Roundworms, tapeworms, and other parasites would consume nutrients from your already inadequate diet, leaving you weak, malnourished, and prone to illness. The medications available to treat these conditions were often as dangerous as the parasites themselves. Wound care was primitive and dangerous. Any cut or injury could become infected and kill you. Medieval people had no understanding of antiseptics or sterile procedures. Wounds were often treated with substances that actually increased infection risk, like animal dung, which was believed to have healing properties. As an assassin, you'd be more likely to suffer injuries than ordinary people, but less able to seek proper treatment. A simple knife cut during a burglary could become infected and kill you slowly over weeks. Broken bones often healed poorly or not at all, leaving you permanently disabled. Respiratory diseases were common and often fatal. The damp, cold conditions where assassins often hid, combined with poor nutrition and constant stress, would make you highly susceptible to pneumonia, tuberculosis, and other lung diseases. Medieval treatments for respiratory ailments were largely ineffective, and many patients died from what we'd now consider minor infections. Skin diseases were rampant in medieval times. Poor hygiene, contaminated water, and constant exposure to dirt and filth would cause various skin conditions that ranged from uncomfortable to deadly. Erysipelas, a bacterial skin infection, could kill within days. Scabies would cause such intense itching that victims sometimes scratched themselves to death. Mental health problems, while not understood in medical terms, would manifest in physical symptoms. The constant stress, trauma, and isolation of assassin life would cause what medieval people might interpret as demonic possession or divine punishment. You might suffer from what we'd now recognize as severe anxiety, depression, or PTSD, but there was no treatment available except prayer and possibly exorcism. Nutritional deficiencies would affect every aspect of your health. Scurvy from lack of vitamin C would cause your teeth to fall out and your wounds to reopen. Rickets from vitamin D deficiency would weaken your bones. Iron deficiency anemia would leave you weak and unable to function effectively. Vision problems were common and untreatable if you were nearsighted, farsighted, or developed cataracts. there was little that could be done. Eyeglasses existed, but were extremely expensive and rare. Poor vision would make infiltration, escape, and combat much more difficult. Sexually transmitted diseases were rampant and incurable. If you had any contact with prostitutes or casual partners, you risked contracting syphilis, gonorrhea, or other diseases that would slowly destroy your body and mind. These diseases were often seen as divine punishment for immoral behavior. Food. Poisoning was a constant threat. Without refrigeration or understanding of food safety, spoiled or contaminated food was common. Food poisoning could incapacitate you for days or weeks, leaving you vulnerable to capture or death from dehydration. Ergotism, caused by eating rye infected with ergot fungus, could cause hallucinations, convulsions, and death. This condition was common enough to have a name, St. Anthony's fire, and could affect entire communities when contaminated grain was consumed. The cumulative effect of all these health problems would be devastating. Even if you somehow avoided violent death, your body would break down rapidly under the strain of assassin life. Most medieval people looked much older than their chronological age due to hard living, and assassins would age even faster. Pain management was limited to alcohol, and perhaps some herbal remedies like willow bark, which contains compounds similar to aspirin. But chronic pain would be a constant companion, affecting your sleep, judgment, and physical capabilities. The psychological impact of constant physical discomfort can't be overstated. When you're always in pain, always itching, always fighting, off infections, your mental state deteriorates rapidly. You become irritable, have difficulty concentrating, and make poor decisions, all potentially fatal for an assassin. Medieval medical theory was based on balancing the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Treatments often involved bloodletting, purging, or other procedures that weakened patients rather than helping them. If you did seek medical care, the treatment might be worse than the disease. Chapter 22. The Weather War. Seasonal Challenges, Medieval. Assassins didn't just fight human enemies, they fought the weather. And in a world without modern clothing, heating, or weather prediction, the elements were often deadlier than any sword. Winter was your greatest enemy. Modern people can't comprehend how brutal medieval winters were for people without proper shelter or clothing. Temperatures that would be merely uncomfortable for someone with modern gear could be fatal for a medieval assassin. Hypothermia was a constant threat during cold months. Your inadequate clothing, poor nutrition, and frequent exposure to the elements would make you vulnerable to potentially fatal drops in body temperature. The early stages of hypothermia affect judgment and coordination, exactly the skills you'd need most for survival. Frostbite would claim fingers, toes, and other extremities with frightening regularity. Once frostbitten, these body parts might never function properly again, severely limiting your capabilities. Medieval treatment for frostbite was often worse than no treatment at all, sometimes involving amputation with crude tools and no anesthesia. Wet clothing in winter could be a death sentence. If you fell into water, were caught in rain, or even worked up a sweat, your wet clothes would conduct heat away from your body much faster than dry clothes. Without the ability to quickly dry your clothing or change into dry garments, you could die from hypothermia even in moderately cold weather. Snow and ice made travel treacherous and left tracks that could be followed for days. Your footprints in snow would create a trail leading directly to your hiding places. Ice on roads and paths would slow your movement and increase the risk of injury from falls. Fuel for fires was often unavailable or too dangerous to use. Lighting. A fire would create smoke that could reveal your location, and gathering fuel required time and exposure that might not be safe. Many nights would be spent shivering in inadequate shelter, using only body heat and poor clothing for warmth. Spring brought different challenges. Melting snow created floods that could trap you in low-lying areas, or wash away bridges and fords you needed to cross. Rivers that were frozen solid in winter became raging torrents that were impossible to cross safely. Mud season made travel nearly impossible. Medieval roads were barely adequate in good weather, but spring mud could bog down even experienced travelers. You might sink knee-deep in mud and be unable to move quickly if pursued. Muddy conditions also made it easier to leave tracks and harder to move silently. Spring flooding contaminated water sources and spread disease. Stagnant water left by floods became breeding grounds for disease-carrying insects. The increased humidity and moisture created ideal conditions for respiratory infections and skin diseases. Summer presented its own dangers. Without air conditioning, cooling systems, or adequate water supplies, extreme heat could be as deadly as extreme cold. Dehydration was a constant threat, especially for someone doing physical work while wearing dark clothing for concealment. Heat exhaustion and heat stroke were real dangers during summer operations. The heavy clothing required for concealing weapons and maintaining disguises would be stifling in hot weather. Overheating affected judgment and physical performance just when you needed them most. Insect-borne diseases were primarily a summer problem. Malaria, transmitted by mosquitoes, was common in many areas and often fatal. Other insects carried diseases like typhus, plague, and various fevers. The lack of effective insect repellents meant constant exposure to disease-carrying pests. Drought could make water sources scarce and force you to take risks to find drinking water. Wells might dry up, streams might stop flowing, and the remaining water sources would be carefully watched by authorities or heavily used by local populations. Extreme heat made food spoilage a major problem. Without refrigeration, food would rot quickly in hot weather, increasing the risk of food poisoning and making it harder to maintain adequate nutrition. Autumn brought harvest season, which created both opportunities and dangers. Increased activity in rural areas might provide cover for your movements, but it also meant more people were around to spot suspicious activity. The end of harvest, often, meant increased celebrations and gatherings that could provide opportunities to approach targets. Early winter preparation was crucial for survival. You'd need to acquire warmer clothing, find more secure shelter, and stockpile food and fuel before the worst weather arrived. But these preparations required resources most assassins didn't have, and activities that might reveal your presence. Weather prediction was impossible beyond a day or two. You couldn't plan operations around weather conditions because there was no way to know what conditions would be like even a few days in advance. A mission planned for clear weather might be executed during a blizzard, fundamentally changing the risks and requirements. Seasonal diseases followed predictable patterns that would affect your health and capabilities. Winter brought respiratory infections, spring brought fevers and flooding-related diseases, summer brought insect-borne illnesses, and autumn brought harvest-related accidents and food contamination. The psychological impact of seasonal challenges was severe. Months of cold, wet, dark conditions would cause what we'd now recognize as seasonal affective disorder. The constant battle against the elements would wear down your mental resistance and make all other challenges seem more difficult. Clothing adaptation was expensive and difficult. You'd need different clothes for different seasons, but acquiring appropriate clothing required money you probably didn't have, and trips to markets or cities where you might be recognized. Most assassins probably wore the same inadequate clothing year-round. Seasonal work patterns affected target accessibility and security. Nobles might move between properties seasonally, changing their routines and security arrangements. Servants might be dismissed or hired seasonally, affecting your ability to infiltrate households. Chapter 23. The urban jungle. City-based assassination cities offered both the greatest opportunities and the greatest dangers for medieval assassins. The urban environment was a complex maze of politics, crime, commerce, and surveillance that could make or break an assassination operation. Medieval cities were crowded, chaotic, and dangerous for everyone, but they were particularly hazardous for assassins. The concentration of people meant more witnesses, more potential informants, and more opportunities for your cover to be blown. But it also meant more places to hide, more distractions for guards, and better access to targets. Urban architecture created unique challenges and opportunities. Multi-story buildings offered elevated positions for observation and attack, but they also created choke points and limited escape routes. Narrow streets and alleys could provide concealment, but could also become traps if you were pursued. City walls and gates controlled access, and created bottlenecks that could be watched by authorities. Once the gates closed at night, you were trapped inside the city until morning. This meant timing your operations carefully to ensure you could escape before lockdown, or being prepared to hide within the city until the gates reopened. Guild systems controlled most legitimate economic activity in medieval cities. Each trade had its own guild with specific rules, territories, and members. Posing as a craftsman or merchant required understanding these guild structures and having convincing explanations for why you weren't properly affiliated with the relevant guild organizations. Urban crime was organized differently than rural crime. Cities had established criminal hierarchies with territories, specializations, and enforcement mechanisms. Entering a city as an assassin meant potentially stepping on the toes of established criminal organizations, who might see you as competition or a threat to their operations. Watch systems provided law enforcement that was more systematic than rural justice. Cities employed professional watchmen who patrolled regularly, knew their territories well, and had established procedures for investigating crimes. These watchmen often knew the local population and would notice strangers or suspicious behavior. Market areas provided excellent opportunities for gathering intelligence and approaching targets, but they were also heavily watched and regulated. Merchants had to have licenses, pay fees, and follow specific rules about where and when they could operate. Impersonating a merchant required detailed knowledge of these regulations and the ability to produce convincing documentation. Taverns and inns were crucial gathering places for information, but they were also meeting places for informants and undercover officials. The same establishments that might provide intelligence about your targets could also be places where your own activities were being observed and reported. Religious institutions in cities were often wealthy and politically powerful. Cathedrals, monasteries, and major churches had their own security forces, territories, and legal jurisdictions. Some religious institutions offered sanctuary that could protect fugitives, but they also had extensive networks of contacts who could provide information to authorities. Sewerage and waste disposal systems in medieval cities created opportunities for concealed movement, but also exposed you to diseases and dangerous conditions. Urban sewers were often partially open and could be navigated by someone desperate enough to endure the stench and health risks. Fire was a constant danger in medieval cities due to wooden construction and open flames used for lighting and heating. Fires spread rapidly and could trap you in burning buildings or force you to flee into the open where you could be spotted by authorities. Some assassins used arson as a diversion, but this often caused more harm than intended. Urban poverty created both opportunities and dangers. Poor areas of cities were less well patrolled and offered places to hide, but they were also where criminals were most active and where violence was most common. You might find allies among the urban poor, but you'd also find competitors and enemies. Merchant districts were where wealthy targets were most likely to be found, but they were also the most heavily guarded and regulated areas of cities. These districts had their own security forces, restricted access, and careful monitoring of who came and went. Noble quarters in cities were fortified areas with controlled access and heavy security. Getting into these areas required convincing documentation, legitimate business, or successful infiltration of the service systems that supported them. Communication networks in cities were sophisticated and rapid. News, rumors, and warnings could spread through urban populations much faster than in rural areas. A suspicious incident in one part of the city could result in increased security throughout the urban area within hours. Urban diseases were different from rural diseases and were often more virulent due to crowded living conditions and poor sanitation. Plague, cholera, and other epidemic diseases spread rapidly through urban populations and could kill you even if you avoided human enemies. Economic opportunities in cities were more diverse, but also more regulated. You might find work as a laborer, servant, or in various trades, but most legitimate employment required references, guild membership, or other documentation that would be difficult for an assassin to obtain. Legal jurisdiction in cities was often complex, with different authorities responsible for different areas or types of crimes. Understanding who had authority where could be crucial for planning operations and escapes, but it required detailed local knowledge that outsiders rarely possessed. Chapter 24: Rural Assassination. The countryside. Challenge. Rural assassination presented completely different challenges than urban operations. The countryside might seem safer and less monitored, but for medieval assassins, rural areas created unique dangers that were often more deadly than city hazards. Population density in rural areas meant everyone knew everyone else. Strangers were immediately noticeable and would be questioned about their business, their origins, and their destinations. There was no anonymity in rural communities. Your presence would be noted, discussed, and remembered by virtually everyone you encountered. Travel between rural locations was slow, dangerous, and exhausting. Roads were poor, bandit attacks were common, and weather could make travel impossible for days or weeks. Moving between targets in rural areas required careful planning and significant time investments that urban assassins didn't face. Rural accommodations were limited and suspicious. There were few inns or places to stay, and those that existed were closely watched by local authorities and communities. Strangers seeking accommodations would be questioned extensively and would have their stories verified through local networks. Agricultural cycles dominated rural life and affected everything from population movements to security arrangements. Harvest time, planting season, and other agricultural activities created predictable patterns that could be useful for planning, but they also affected when targets would be accessible and when witnesses would be present. Rural justice was often immediate and violent. Communities that caught criminals might not wait for official authorities but would dispense their own punishment on the spot. This could mean being beaten, hanged, or burned alive without any formal legal proceedings. Isolation in rural areas was both an advantage and a severe disadvantage. You might be able to operate without immediate interference, but you'd also be completely on your own if things went wrong. There was no backup, no quick escape routes, and no alternative resources if your plans failed. Rural targets were often more difficult to approach than urban targets. Nobles in the countryside lived in fortified manors with clear fields of view around their properties. They employed local servants who knew the area intimately and would spot unusual activity immediately. Weather effects were more severe in rural areas because there was less shelter and fewer alternatives when conditions became dangerous. A storm that might be merely inconvenient in a city could be fatal in the countryside if you were caught without adequate shelter. Rural communication networks were different from urban systems, but were often more effective for tracking suspicious individuals. News traveled along predictable routes through rural communities, and information about strangers would be passed from settlement to settlement more systematically than casual urban gossip. Food acquisition in rural areas required different skills and presented different risks. You might be able to hunt or gather food, but these activities required time, equipment, and skills that most assassins didn't possess. Stealing from farmers was risky because agricultural communities were very protective of their food supplies. Rural medicine was even more primitive than urban medicine. If you were injured or became ill in the countryside, there might be no one with even basic medical knowledge for many miles. Folk remedies and religious healing were often the only options available. Seasonal challenges were more extreme in rural areas. Winter isolation could trap you for months in hostile territory, with no resources and no escape routes. Spring flooding could make travel impossible and contaminate water supplies. Summer heat and drought could make finding water and food extremely difficult. Rural economies were less monetized than urban economies. Barter and service exchange were more common than cash transactions. This meant that the money you might earn from assassination contracts would be less useful in rural areas, where people expected goods or services rather than coins. Religious authority was often stronger in rural areas than in cities. Local priests and religious officials had more direct influence over community life and could mobilize religious opposition to suspicious individuals. Churches also served as communication hubs, where information about strangers would be shared and discussed. Geographic knowledge was crucial in rural areas, but was difficult for outsiders to acquire. Knowing which routes were safe, where water sources were located, which areas flooded seasonally, and how to navigate without getting lost required local knowledge that took years to develop. Rural law enforcement was different from urban systems, but was often more effective for dealing with outsiders. Rural areas relied on local militia, armed farmers, and community cooperation to maintain order. These systems were specifically designed to deal with bandits, raiders, and other external threats. Wildlife dangers were more significant in rural areas. Wolves, bears, and other predators posed real threats to travelers, especially those who were weakened by poor nutrition or injury. Even smaller animals like venomous snakes or disease-carrying ticks could be dangerous. Rural social structures were more rigid and traditional than urban structures. Class distinctions were more pronounced. Social roles were more clearly defined, and violations of social norms were more quickly noticed and punished. An assassin trying to blend into rural society would have fewer options for believable cover. Identities. Chapter 25. The Female Assassin. Additional impossible challenges. Women who attempted assassination in medieval times faced all the standard challenges, plus additional obstacles that made an already impossible profession even more deadly. Medieval society's restrictions on women created unique vulnerabilities that would doom female assassins to even faster failure. Legal status of women made them particularly vulnerable to exploitation and abuse. Women had fewer legal rights than men and were often considered property of their fathers or husbands. A woman operating independently would immediately be seen as suspicious because autonomous women were rare and often associated with prostitution or witchcraft. Physical limitations imposed by medieval clothing would make combat and escape much more difficult for women. Long skirts, tight bodices, and elaborate headdresses weren't designed for running, climbing, or fighting. Women's clothing also provided fewer places to conceal weapons and made quick movement almost impossible. Social restrictions severely limited women's mobility and access. Women couldn't travel alone without raising suspicions, couldn't enter many establishments unaccompanied, and couldn't engage in many occupations that might provide cover for assassination activities. The social expectations for women's behavior were so restrictive that almost any action required for assassination would mark them as suspicious. Sexual violence was a constant threat that male assassins didn't face. Women traveling alone or staying in questionable accommodations would be vulnerable to rape and assault. The threat of sexual violence would force female assassins to take additional precautions that would limit their operational flexibility. Pregnancy and menstruation created additional health challenges that could be incapacitating. Medieval understanding of women's health was minimal, and there were no effective treatments for problems related to reproductive health. Pregnancy would make assassination work impossible, while menstruation could cause debilitating pain and bleeding that would compromise operational effectiveness. Marriage expectations meant that unmarried women were viewed with suspicion, while married women were expected to be under their husband's control. Either status would create problems for a woman trying to operate as an independent assassin. Widows had slightly more autonomy, but were often impoverished and vulnerable. Religious restrictions were particularly harsh for women. The medieval church taught that women were inherently sinful and required male supervision. Female assassins would be seen as particularly evil because they were violating both civil and religious laws while acting contrary to their supposed nature. Economic limitations were severe for medieval women. Most occupations were closed to women, and those that were available typically paid much less than comparable men's work. This made it harder for women to acquire the resources needed for assassination operations. Combat training was virtually non-existent for medieval women. While some noble women might learn basic self-defense, systematic weapons training was rare. Women assassins would be at a severe disadvantage in any physical confrontation with male opponents who had more training and physical strength. Infiltration opportunities were limited by the types of roles available to women. While women could sometimes infiltrate households as servants, the range of believable female roles was much narrower than for men. Women couldn't pose as merchants, clergy, soldiers, or craftsmen in most circumstances. Reproductive health knowledge was limited and dangerous. Medieval treatments for women's health problems were often harmful or fatal. Women had no effective birth control methods and limited understanding of their own reproductive systems, making sexual contact extremely risky. Beauty standards and appearance expectations created additional challenges. Women were expected to maintain certain standards of appearance that required time, resources, and attention that assassins couldn't afford. Failing to meet these standards would mark a woman as suspicious or low class. Domestic violence was normalized and legal in medieval society. A woman who showed signs of violence or injury wouldn't necessarily receive help or protection because physical abuse of women was considered normal and acceptable. This normalization of violence against women would make it easier for enemies to harm female assassins without consequence. Witchcraft accusations were a constant threat for any woman who behaved unconventionally. The association between independent women and witchcraft meant that female assassins were at risk of being accused of supernatural crimes in addition to their actual crimes. Witchcraft trials were often death sentences regardless of actual guilt. Educational limitations meant most women couldn't read or write, which would make it impossible to handle written communications, forge documents, or gather intelligence from written sources. The few literate women were mostly from upper classes and would be easily identifiable. Guild restrictions excluded women from most professional organizations that might provide cover identities. Women couldn't join craft guilds, merchant associations, or other professional groups that would give them legitimate reasons to travel or access to target locations. Medical knowledge available to women was limited to folk remedies and midwifery. Women had even less access to medical care than men, and were often blamed for their own illnesses. Female assassins would have fewer options for treating injuries or diseases. Social networks available to women were different from men's networks, and were often focused on domestic and family concerns rather than the types of criminal or political contacts that might be useful for assassination work. Building the necessary networks for successful assassination would be much more difficult for women. Punishment for female criminals was often more severe and more public than punishment for male criminals. Women who violated social norms were seen as particularly threatening to social order, and their punishments were designed to be spectacular deterrents to other women who might consider stepping outside accepted roles. Physical strength differences would make many assassination techniques impractical for women. Strangulation, stabbing through armor or heavy clothing, and overpowering victims would be much more difficult for women than for men. This would limit the range of effective assassination methods available to female killers. The combination of all these factors meant that women who attempted assassination faced overwhelming obstacles that made success virtually impossible. The few historical examples of successful female assassins were typically either operating with significant support from male accomplices, or were in very specific circumstances that minimized these challenges. Chapter 26. International Operations. The nightmare of foreign assignment, operating as an assassin in foreign territories, multiplied every challenge exponentially. Medieval Europe was a patchwork of different languages, customs, laws, and political systems that would trap and kill foreign assassins with ruthless efficiency. Language barriers would be immediately fatal for most assassination operations. Medieval Europe had hundreds of distinct languages and dialects, often changing dramatically within short distances. Even if you spoke the major language of a region, your accent would immediately mark you as foreign and suspicious. Local dialects and slang could betray you even if you spoke the basic language. Each region had specific ways of speaking that identified locals versus outsiders. Using the wrong word, mispronouncing local place names, or failing to understand regional expressions would immediately expose you as a stranger. Cultural customs varied dramatically between regions and could be as dangerous as language differences. What was considered polite behavior in one area might be insulting in another. Religious practices, social courtesies, business customs, and daily routines all differed between regions and required detailed knowledge to navigate successfully. Legal systems were completely different between territories, affecting everything from investigation procedures to punishment methods. What might be considered evidence in one region could be inadmissible in another. Understanding local legal customs was essential for planning operations and escapes. Currency and economic systems varied between regions and were often incompatible. Coins that were valuable in one area might be worthless in another. Exchange rates, trade relationships, and commercial practices all required local knowledge that foreign assassins couldn't easily acquire. Religious differences created additional complications even within Christianity. Catholic regions had different practices than Orthodox areas. Local saint veneration, religious holidays, and church hierarchies all varied and required understanding to avoid making suspicious mistakes. Political relationships between regions meant that foreigners might be viewed with suspicion based on their origins. Someone from a territory currently at war with your target area would face immediate hostility and investigation that would make covert operations nearly impossible. Documentation requirements varied between territories and were often complex and difficult to forge. Travel passes, trade licenses, and identification documents all had region-specific features that would be difficult to replicate convincingly without local expertise. Social hierarchies and class systems differed between regions and could trap foreign assassins who misunderstood local customs. Behavior that was appropriate for one social class in one region might be completely wrong in another area, immediately marking you as foreign or suspicious. Military traditions and security practices reflected local history and threats. Some regions had more sophisticated security measures based on their experience with foreign invasions or internal conflicts. Understanding these local security practices was essential for planning successful operations. Food customs and dining practices could expose foreign assassins who didn't understand local eating habits. Regional cuisines, meal timing, table manners, and food preparation methods all required knowledge that took time to acquire and could be difficult to fake convincingly. Seasonal patterns and climate differences between regions meant that clothing, travel routines, and daily activities all varied. Someone dressed inappropriately for local weather or following the wrong seasonal schedule would be immediately noticeable as foreign. Professional practices and trade customs differed dramatically between regions. Craftsmen in different areas used different techniques, tools, and materials. Merchants followed different practices and had access to different goods. Impersonating local professionals required detailed technical knowledge. Local geography and navigation knowledge was essential for planning operations and escapes, but was difficult for foreigners to acquire. Knowing which routes were safe, where resources could be found, and how to avoid natural hazards required experience that outsiders rarely possessed. Communication networks and information flow followed different patterns in each region. Understanding how news traveled, who the key information brokers were, and how to access local intelligence networks required time and connections that foreign assassins couldn't quickly develop. Personal relationships and family connections were crucial for operating successfully in medieval communities, but they took years to develop and were almost impossible for outsiders to replicate convincingly. Local people had complex webs of relationships that provided support and information. Historical knowledge and local events affected daily conversations and social interactions. Not knowing about important local history, recent events, or current controversies would mark you as obviously foreign and potentially suspicious. Regional diseases and health challenges require different survival strategies and medical knowledge. Endemic diseases, local parasites, and regional health problems all required specific knowledge and preparation that foreign assassins wouldn't possess. Ethnic and racial differences could make some foreign operations completely impossible. Physical, appearance, cultural markers, and ethnic tensions could make it impossible for some assassins to operate in certain regions, regardless of their skills or preparation. Weather patterns and natural disasters were region-specific and could trap unprepared foreign assassins. Knowing when floods, storms, or other natural events were likely to occur was essential for planning operations and ensuring survival. The combination of all these factors meant that international assassination operations were exponentially more difficult than domestic ones. The few successful foreign assassinations in medieval history typically involved either local accomplices who provided essential support or assassins who spent years in target regions learning local customs and building necessary networks. Chapter 27. The Information War. Intelligence and counter-intelligence. Success in medieval assassination depended more on information than on weapons skills, yet gathering reliable intelligence was one of the most dangerous and difficult aspects of the profession. You were fighting an information war against enemies who held every advantage. Intelligence gathering required extended surveillance that exposed you to discovery and capture. Watching your target's movements, learning their routines, and identifying their vulnerabilities meant spending days or weeks in areas where you might be noticed by guards, servants, or other observers who could report suspicious activity. Human intelligence sources were expensive, unreliable, and dangerous to cultivate. Bribing servants for information about their master's schedules exposed you to blackmail and betrayal. The servants might report your inquiries to their masters, take your money without providing useful information, or provide false information that would lead you into traps. Infiltrating target households as a servant was the most effective intelligence gathering method, but also the most dangerous. Household staff were carefully selected for loyalty and were often related to each other through family connections that took generations to develop. Outsiders trying to infiltrate these networks would be noticed immediately. Counterintelligence. Operations by your targets were more sophisticated than you might expect. Important people understood they had enemies and took active measures to identify threats. They used loyal servants to watch for suspicious activity, employed professional informants to monitor potential threats, and maintained communication networks that could provide early warning of danger. False information was often deliberately spread to trap potential assassins. Targets might deliberately leak false schedules, spread rumors about security measures, or plant misleading information about their movements to create opportunities to identify and capture threats. Distinguishing between real intelligence and deliberate disinformation required skills most assassins didn't possess. Communication interception was a real threat even in medieval times. Important people often employed agents to monitor communications, intercept messages, and identify potentially dangerous correspondence. Any written communication involved risks of discovery that could expose entire assassination plots. Information verification was extremely difficult without modern communication technology. Intelligence gathered from one source couldn't be easily confirmed through independent sources. This meant assassins often operated on incomplete or inaccurate information that could lead to failure or capture. Local knowledge requirements were enormous and required time most assassins didn't have. Understanding local politics, family relationships, business connections, and social hierarchies was essential for interpreting intelligence and planning operations. This knowledge took years to develop and was difficult for outsiders to acquire quickly. Document intelligence was limited by literacy rates and record-keeping practices. Most medieval people couldn't read, and important information was often transmitted orally rather than in writing. This made it difficult to gather intelligence through document theft or interception. Technical surveillance capabilities were primitive, but still dangerous. Guards, servants, and other observers could provide detailed reports about suspicious individuals. Physical evidence like footprints, clothing fibers, or abandoned equipment could be used to track assassins and identify their methods. Economic intelligence about your targets was essential for planning operations, but was often closely guarded. Understanding how targets acquired their wealth, who their business partners were, and what financial pressures they faced could provide insights into vulnerabilities and opportunities for approach. Political intelligence was crucial, but constantly changing. Alliances, conflicts, and political relationships shifted rapidly in medieval politics. Information that was accurate when gathered might be obsolete by the time operations began, leading to disasters when political situations changed. Religious Intelligence affected target behavior and security arrangements. Understanding religious obligations, ceremonial requirements, and spiritual practices could provide opportunities for approach or escape. But religious information was also used by targets to vary their routines and avoid predictable patterns. Military. Intelligence about security forces was essential but difficult to acquire. Understanding guard rotations, security procedures, and defensive capabilities required careful observation that exposed assassins to discovery. Military personnel were also trained to spot surveillance and could identify threats more effectively than civilian targets. Family intelligence about target relationships was crucial for understanding motivations, vulnerabilities, and potential consequences of assassination operations. But family information was closely guarded and was often used to mislead potential threats about actual relationships and loyalties. Historical intelligence about previous assassination attempts could provide useful lessons, but also warned targets about potential methods and approaches. Studying previous failures could help avoid similar mistakes, but could also alert targets to specific threats and countermeasures. Medical intelligence about target health could provide opportunities for poisoning or could indicate when targets might be most vulnerable. But medical information was closely guarded and was often deliberately falsified to mislead potential enemies about target capabilities and vulnerabilities. The intelligence requirements for successful assassination were so extensive and the risks of gathering information so severe that most assassination attempts failed at the intelligence gathering stage long before any actual killing was attempted. The information war was where most medieval assassins lost their lives, betrayed by sources they trusted or discovered during surveillance operations they couldn't avoid. Chapter 28. Tools of Torture. What awaited captured assassins? If you were caught as a medieval assassin, death wouldn't come quickly or mercifully. The torture and execution methods waiting for captured assassins were specifically designed to extract information, terrorize potential accomplices, and serve as public entertainment that reinforced social order. Preliminary torture began immediately upon capture and was designed to break your will before formal interrogation began. Guards would beat you with clubs, fists, and improvised weapons to soften you up psychologically and physically. This wasn't random violence. It was systematic conditioning to make you more compliant during formal questioning. The rack was perhaps the most famous torture device and was specifically designed to cause maximum pain while keeping victims alive for extended periods. Your arms and legs would be tied to rollers that could be turned to gradually stretch your body until joints dislocated and muscles tore. The psychological impact of hearing your own joints pop was often as effective as the physical pain. The strappado involved tying your arms behind your back and suspending you by your wrists, often with weights attached to your feet to increase the stretching effect. This torture could dislocate your shoulders within minutes and cause permanent nerve damage that would leave your arms useless even if you somehow survived. Water torture techniques included forced drowning, where water was poured over cloth covering your face to simulate drowning, and forced consumption of water until your stomach distended painfully. These methods left no permanent marks, but could be extremely effective at breaking psychological resistance. Crushing devices were used to apply gradual pressure to specific body parts, often starting with fingers and toes before moving to larger areas. Thumb screws could crush finger bones, while larger devices could crush feet, hands, or even heads. The gradual increase in pressure allowed torturers to calibrate pain levels precisely. Hot iron torture involved heating metal implements and applying them to sensitive parts of your body. Eyes, genitals, and open wounds were favorite targets because they caused maximum pain and psychological trauma. The smell of burning flesh was often as psychologically damaging as the physical pain. Flaying involved removing strips of skin while keeping victims alive and conscious. This was usually done gradually, starting with less sensitive areas and moving to more sensitive parts as interrogation continued. The combination of pain, blood loss, and psychological trauma made this one of the most effective torture methods. The wheel was used for both torture and execution. Victims would be tied to large wheels and beaten with hammers or clubs to break bones systematically. The wheel could then be raised on a pole to display the broken body publicly, while the victims slowly died from their injuries. Impalement was a torture method that could take days to kill victims. A sharpened stake would be inserted through the body in ways designed to avoid vital organs initially, allowing victims to live for extended periods while experiencing excruciating pain. The psychological impact on witnesses was as important as the physical torture of victims. Eye removal was a common torture technique that served multiple purposes. It caused extreme pain, permanently disabled victims, and created a visual reminder of what happened to people who opposed authority. Special tools were developed specifically for eye removal that would cause maximum pain while avoiding fatal injury. Genital torture was used on both male and female victims and was designed to attack the most sensitive and psychologically significant parts of the body. These techniques often combined physical pain with sexual humiliation and psychological trauma that could break resistance even in very determined individuals. The breaking wheel was a refinement of wheel torture that involved breaking specific bones in predetermined patterns to maximize pain while keeping victims alive. Executioners were trained in the proper sequence of bone breaking to ensure victims remained conscious and able to provide information throughout the process. Burning alive was sometimes used as both torture and execution. Victims might be burned gradually, starting with extremities and moving toward vital organs. Different types of fuel burned at different temperatures and speeds, allowing torturers to control the pace and intensity of the torture. Boiling alive was another gradual torture method that allowed precise control over pain levels. Water or oil could be heated gradually while victims were immersed, or heated liquids could be poured over specific body parts. The psychological anticipation was often as effective as the physical pain. Drawing and quartering was reserved for the most serious crimes and involved multiple stages of torture before final execution. Victims would be dragged through streets, hanged until nearly dead, disemboweled while still alive, and then cut into quarters. Each stage was designed to maximize pain and public spectacle. Psychological torture accompanied all physical torture and was designed to break mental resistance as well as physical endurance. Torturers would describe what they planned to do, show victims the tools they would use, and often torture family members or associates in front of victims to increase psychological pressure. Medical torture involved using medical knowledge to maximize pain while avoiding death. Skilled torturers understood anatomy well enough to avoid vital organs and major blood vessels while still causing extreme pain. They could also revive unconscious victims and treat wounds to keep victims alive for extended torture sessions. Duration of torture could extend for days, weeks, or even months, depending on the information authorities wanted and the resistance offered by victims. Victims were kept alive through medical treatment and careful nutrition to ensure they remained capable of providing information throughout extended torture periods. Public torture served multiple purposes beyond information extraction. It provided entertainment for the population, demonstrated royal power and justice, and served as a deterrent to potential criminals. The public nature of torture meant that even if you somehow survived, you'd be permanently marked and would never be able to resume normal life. The sophistication and variety of medieval torture methods demonstrates that authorities took assassination very seriously and were prepared to invest significant resources in deterring and punishing assassins. The knowledge that these techniques awaited captured assassins would have been a powerful psychological deterrent for anyone considering the profession. Chapter 29. The Economics of Death, Money, Markets, and Murder. The medieval assassination trade operated within economic systems that made financial success nearly impossible for working assassins, while enriching the middlemen and power brokers who arranged the contracts. Pricing structures for assassination contracts were determined by factors that had little to do with the actual difficulty or risk of the operations. The social status of targets was often more important than their security arrangements in determining prices. Killing a minor noble might pay more than assassinating a well-guarded merchant, simply because noble blood was considered more valuable. Market dynamics were heavily influenced by supply and demand factors that fluctuated unpredictably. Political instability increased demand for assassination services, but also increased the risks of getting caught. Economic downturns created more desperate people willing to attempt assassination, but reduced the amount of money available to pay for contracts. Payment schedules were designed to exploit assassins and minimize client risks. Typical arrangements involved small advance payments with the majority due upon successful completion of contracts. This meant assassins had to fund most of their operational expenses from their own resources while accepting the risk that clients might refuse final payment. Currency exchange problems affected assassins who worked across regional boundaries. Different territories often used different coins with varying precious metal content and exchange rates. Understanding currency values and exchange procedures required knowledge most assassins didn't possess, making them vulnerable to financial exploitation. Operating expenses consumed most assassination income and were often underestimated by both clients and assassins. Bribes, equipment, travel costs, lodging, food, and other operational necessities could easily exceed the total payment for contracts, leaving assassins financially worse off after successful operations. Competition between assassins kept prices low and increased risks for everyone involved. Clients could easily find alternative assassins if their initial choices demanded higher prices or better terms. This competitive pressure forced assassins to accept increasingly dangerous contracts for inadequate compensation. Middlemen and brokers took substantial percentages of contract values while accepting none of the risks. These intermediaries often made more money arranging assassinations than the assassins made performing them. The complex networks of intermediaries also made it difficult for assassins to negotiate directly with clients. Investment requirements for successful assassination operations were substantial and required upfront capital. Most assassins didn't possess quality equipment, reliable intelligence, and adequate preparation, all required resources that exceeded the financial capabilities of most people desperate enough to consider assassination. Insurance and risk management concepts didn't exist in forms that would protect assassins. There were no mechanisms for protecting against client default, operational failures, or unexpected complications. Assassins absorbed all financial risks while clients retained all the benefits. Quality control standards were impossible to establish or enforce in assassination markets. Clients had no reliable way to evaluate assassin capabilities before hiring them, and assassins had no way to verify client reliability or payment capacity. This lack of quality control led to frequent mismatches between contracts and capabilities. Repeat business was rare because successful assassins usually died or retired, while unsuccessful ones were eliminated by law enforcement or clients. This meant assassins couldn't build sustainable customer relationships or develop reliable income streams through repeat contracts. Market segmentation created different sub-markets with different pricing and risk structures. Religious assassinations, political murders, and personal revenge killings all operated under different economic conditions, with different participant pools and different risk-reward calculations. Geographic factors affected assassination pricing and availability. Remote targets required higher payments to compensate for increased travel costs and risks, but they also attracted fewer qualified assassins. Urban targets might be more accessible, but required different skill sets and resources. Seasonal variations. In assassination, demand reflected political cycles, agricultural patterns, and social events that created opportunities for elimination. Understanding these patterns could help assassins plan their activities, but it also meant dealing with unpredictable income flows and extended periods without work. Inflation and economic instability affected the real value of assassination contracts. Over time, long-term contracts might become worthless if economic conditions change between agreement and execution. Short-term contracts offered more predictable values but provided less financial security. Tax implications of assassination income were complicated by the illegal nature of the profession. Assassins couldn't report their income or claim business expenses, making them vulnerable to tax enforcement if they displayed wealth inconsistent with their apparent legitimate occupations. Banking and financial services were unavailable to assassins because of the illegal nature of their work. They couldn't maintain bank accounts, obtain loans, or use other financial services that might make their operations more efficient or profitable. Estate planning was impossible for assassins because they couldn't legally own property or maintain documented financial relationships. Any wealth they accumulated would likely be lost when they died, providing no benefits to families or associates. Professional development opportunities didn't exist in assassination markets. There were no training programs, certification systems, or career advancement paths that would allow assassins to improve their skills or increase their earning potential over time. Labor organization was impossible because assassins couldn't openly associate with each other or form professional organizations that might improve working conditions or standardize pricing. Individual assassins had no collective bargaining power and couldn't influence market conditions. The economic realities of medieval assassination meant that the profession attracted primarily desperate people who had no other options and offered them little hope of financial improvement. The economic structure of assassination markets was designed to benefit clients and intermediaries, while exploiting the people who actually performed the dangerous work. Chapter 30. Legacy of Death. What happened to medieval assassins? The ultimate fate of medieval assassins reveals the true horror of the profession. Unlike other dangerous medieval occupations that at least offered the possibility of survival and success, assassination was designed to consume its practitioners completely. Historical records show us primarily the failures because successful assassins left few traces. The medieval chronicles that mention assassins usually describe their capture, torture, and execution rather than their successes. This documentary bias exists because successful assassins maintained their anonymity while failures became public. Spectacles. Life expectancy for medieval assassins was measured in months rather than years. Most assassination attempts failed within the first few operations, either because of inadequate planning, insufficient skills, or simple bad luck. Even successful assassins rarely survived more than a few years because the accumulated risks eventually caught up with them. Capture rates were extremely high because medieval assassination techniques left significant evidence and because authorities took political murder very seriously. Torture was used systematically to extract information about accomplices, methods, and future plans, creating cascading failures that often brought down entire assassination networks. Execution methods used for captured assassins were specifically designed to be public spectacles that would deter others from following similar paths. The gruesome deaths of captured assassins became stories that were told and retold throughout medieval communities as warnings about the consequences of political violence. Betrayal by clients was probably the most common cause of assassin deaths. Clients had strong incentives to eliminate assassins after successful operations to prevent blackmail, reduce evidence, and avoid ongoing financial obligations. Many assassination contracts were followed immediately by secondary contracts targeting the original assassins. Betrayal by associates was nearly as common as client betrayal. Criminal networks were unstable and treacherous, with members constantly seeking advantages over their associates. Information about assassins was valuable enough to make betrayal profitable for criminal contacts who knew their identities and methods. Family consequences extended beyond the assassins themselves to their relatives and associates. Medieval justice systems often punished entire families for serious crimes, and the children and spouses of assassins might face exile, property confiscation, or even execution simply because of their family connections. Religious consequences were severe in medieval Christian society. Assassins were considered to have committed mortal sins that damned their souls for eternity. Even if they escaped earthly justice, they faced the prospect of eternal punishment in hell, according to prevailing religious beliefs. Social legacy was one of complete erasure and condemnation. Assassins couldn't be honored or remembered positively because their actions were universally condemned by medieval society. Their names, when recorded at all, were preserved only as warnings rather than as commemorations. Economic legacy was universally negative because assassins couldn't accumulate or transfer wealth legitimately. Any money they earned would be lost when they died, providing no benefits to families or communities. The profession offered no path to building lasting economic benefits. Political impact of medieval assassinations was often minimal because the underlying political problems that motivated assassinations usually persisted beyond the deaths of individual targets. Killing one corrupt official rarely solved systemic corruption, and eliminating one rival rarely ended political conflicts. Psychological legacy affected not just the assassins, but their communities and families. The knowledge that family members had become murderers created lasting trauma and social stigma that could affect entire communities for generations. Medical legacy included the diseases, injuries, and physical disabilities that surviving assassins carried for the rest of their lives. The brutal conditions of assassin life left permanent marks on bodies and minds that couldn't be hidden or healed with medieval medical knowledge. Legal precedents created by assassination cases often led to harsher laws and more severe punishments for political violence. The response to assassinations usually involved strengthening security systems and increasing penalties, making conditions worse for future would-be assassins. Cultural memory of medieval assassins was shaped by their portrayal as villains and cautionary tales, rather than as complex individuals responding to difficult circumstances. The cultural legacy of assassination reinforced negative stereotypes and social controls that restricted individual agency. Technological development was sometimes influenced by assassination attempts as targets invested in better security measures, weapons, and protective devices. The history of assassination contributed to the development of better locks, stronger armor, and more sophisticated security systems. Archaeological evidence of medieval assassinations is rare because the profession left few permanent traces. Unlike other medieval occupations that created lasting material culture, assassination was specifically designed to avoid leaving evidence, making it difficult to study through physical remains. Literary legacy of medieval assassins influenced later cultural representations of political violence and secretive killers. The stories and legends that grew up around historical assassinations created templates for fictional portrayals that persist in modern entertainment media. Comparative analysis with other dangerous medieval professions shows that assassination was uniquely destructive to its practitioners. While soldiers, bandits, and other violent professionals faced high risks, they also had possibilities for survival, success, and social integration that assassins completely lacked. Modern parallels with medieval assassination help explain why the profession was so destructive. Contemporary studies of violence, terrorism, and organized crime show similar patterns of short careers, high casualty rates, and devastating personal consequences for individuals involved in systematic violence. The ultimate lesson from the medieval assassin experience is that political violence, even when motivated by legitimate grievances, typically destroys its practitioners more effectively than it solves underlying problems. The medieval period demonstrates that assassination as a profession was inherently unsustainable and ultimately self-destructive. Chapter 31. Medical horrors, diseases and injuries of the trade. The medical realities facing medieval assassins went far beyond the obvious risks of violence. The lifestyle required for assassination created health problems that would cripple or kill you long before any enemy blade could reach you. Chronic malnutrition was universal among medieval assassins because their lifestyle made regular, adequate nutrition impossible. You couldn't maintain regular meal schedules, couldn't store food safely, and couldn't afford quality nutrition. The constant stress of your profession would increase your caloric needs just as your circumstances made meeting those needs more. Difficult protein deficiency would be particularly severe because meat was expensive and perishable. Without adequate protein, your muscles would waste away, your wounds would heal poorly, and your immune system would fail. The physical demands of assassination required strength and endurance that malnutrition would make impossible to maintain. Vitamin deficiencies would cause systematic health failures that would compromise every aspect of your effectiveness. Scurvy from lack of vitamin C would make your teeth fall out and cause old wounds to reopen. Night blindness from vitamin A deficiency would make covert operations impossible. Rickets from vitamin D deficiency would weaken your bones and make climbing or fighting dangerous. Parasitic infections were inevitable given the living conditions assassins faced. Intestinal worms would compete with you for nutrients from your already inadequate diet. External parasites like lice and fleas would create constant itching that could drive you to distraction and leave infected wounds from scratching. Waterborne diseases would be constant threats because assassins couldn't always access clean water sources. Cholera, dysentery, and typhoid were common killers that could incapacitate you within hours and kill you within days. Even minor digestive problems could be fatal if they occurred during critical operations. Respiratory infections would be aggravated by the damp, cold conditions where assassins often hid. Pneumonia was a major killer that could develop from minor cold symptoms. Tuberculosis was endemic in medieval populations and would spread rapidly in the stress-weakened immune systems of people living rough. Wound infection was perhaps the most immediate medical threat facing assassins. Any cut, scrape, or injury could become infected and kill you slowly and painfully. Medieval understanding of infection was minimal, and treatments often made infections worse rather than better. Tetanus from dirty wounds was a death sentence in medieval times. The bacterial infection caused muscle spasms so severe they could break bones, and the mortality rate was nearly 100%. Any puncture wound from dirty metal or contaminated soil could introduce tetanus bacteria. Ergotism from contaminated grain could cause hallucinations, convulsions, and death. Known as St. Anthony's fire, this condition was common enough to be named and feared. Assassins eating whatever food they could find would be particularly vulnerable to ergot poisoning. Sexually transmitted diseases were rampant in medieval times and were completely incurable. Syphilis could take years to kill you, but would gradually destroy your brain and body in the process. Gonorrhea could cause painful urination and eventual sterility. These diseases were often seen as divine punishment for immoral behavior. Mental health deterioration was inevitable under the stress and trauma of assassin life. What we'd now recognize as PTSD, depression, and anxiety disorders would manifest as physical symptoms that medieval medicine couldn't treat effectively. The psychological toll would eventually destroy your ability to function. Dental health problems would be excruciating and potentially fatal. Abscessed teeth could cause infections that spread to your brain or heart. Tooth loss would make eating difficult and would mark you as obviously unhealthy. Medieval dental procedures were performed without anesthesia and often killed patients. Eye injuries and diseases would be particularly devastating for assassins who depended on vision for survival. Conjunctivitis, cataracts, and injuries from fights or accidents could leave you partially or completely blind. There were no effective treatments for most eye problems. Skin diseases would be constant problems due to poor hygiene and exposure to contaminated environments. Bacterial and fungal infections would create painful, unsightly conditions that could mark you as diseased and undesirable. Some skin infections could become systemic and fatal. Broken bones would heal poorly or not at all without proper medical care. A broken arm or leg could leave you permanently disabled and unable to perform the physical tasks required for assassination. Even minor fractures could become infected and require amputation. Joint problems from physical stress and poor nutrition would make movement painful and difficult. Arthritis was common in medieval times and would be aggravated by the physical demands and harsh living conditions of assassin life. Joint pain would affect your ability to climb, run, or fight effectively. Blood loss from injuries would be difficult to replace, given the poor nutrition and chronic diseases that weakened assassins. Anemia from poor diet would be worsened by any bleeding. and there were no effective treatments for blood loss beyond hoping the bleeding stopped naturally. Digestive problems would be constant due to poor food quality, stress, and irregular eating patterns. Ulcers, constipation, and diarrhea would affect your daily effectiveness and could become severe enough to incapacitate you during critical operations. Kidney and liver problems would develop from poor nutrition, contaminated water, and the toxins you'd encounter in medieval environments. These organs couldn't function properly under the stress of assassin life, leading to gradual system failures that would eventually kill you. The combination of all these medical problems would create a downward spiral where each health issue made you more vulnerable to others. Your weakened immune system would be less able to fight off new infections. Your poor nutrition would make existing problems worse. Your stress levels would aggravate every physical problem you faced. Medieval medical treatments were often more dangerous than the diseases they were supposed to cure. Bloodletting, purging, and other standard treatments would weaken you further. Herbal remedies were unreliable and sometimes toxic. Surgery was performed without anesthesia or antiseptic procedures and had high mortality rates. The medical horrors facing medieval assassins were so severe that most would probably die from disease and malnutrition rather than from violence. The profession didn't just risk your life, it guaranteed the destruction of your health in ways that would make death seem like a mercy. After this exhaustive journey through the nightmare that was medieval assassination, one truth emerges with crystal clarity. You wouldn't have lasted a day, not because you lack courage, intelligence, or determination, but because the profession was specifically designed to destroy anyone foolish enough to attempt it. Every aspect we've examined, from the primitive weapons and non-existent training to the brutal living conditions and inevitable betrayals, reveals assassination as perhaps history's most self-destructive career choice. The economic exploitation, the medical horrors, the psychological torment, the legal consequences, and the social isolation combined to create a perfect storm of human misery. The romantic myths surrounding medieval assassins aren't just wrong. They're dangerous lies that obscure the reality of desperate people trapped in impossible circumstances. The elegant killers of fiction bear no resemblance to the diseased, malnourished, paranoid individuals who actually attempted this profession and died horribly for their efforts. Modern people, accustomed to safety nets, medical care, and legal protections, would be utterly unprepared for the harsh realities of medieval life, let alone the additional challenges of assassination. Your modern knowledge and sensibilities would be useless in a world where survival depended on medieval skills, medieval connections, and medieval understanding of a brutal social system. The historical record is clear. Medieval assassination was a profession with a 100% mortality rate. Whether death came quickly from violence or slowly from disease, whether it resulted from betrayal or incompetence, whether it was public and spectacular or private and forgotten, the end was always the same: death, disgrace, and erasure from history. Even the legendary Nizari Ismailis, with their training, resources, and organizational support, were eventually wiped out completely. If professional, well-supported, ideologically motivated assassins couldn't survive in the long term, what hope would desperate freelancers have had? The medieval world was harsh enough for legitimate citizens trying to live honest lives. For assassins, it was a nightmare designed to consume souls and destroy lives with ruthless efficiency. Every day would bring new threats, new challenges, and new ways to die horribly. The lesson isn't just historical, it's moral and practical. Political violence, even when motivated by genuine grievances, typically destroys its practitioners more effectively than it solves underlying problems. The medieval period demonstrates this truth with brutal clarity through the stories of countless failed assassins whose names we'll never know. So the next time you see a movie about cool, competent assassins effortlessly eliminating targets and vanishing into the shadows, remember what we've learned. Remember the hunger, the disease, the betrayal, and the fear. Remember that behind every romantic legend lies a human reality far more terrible than any fiction. Medieval assassins weren't heroes or anti-heroes or mysterious figures of legend. They were desperate people caught in impossible circumstances, and their stories ended the only way such stories could end, in blood, pain, and forgotten graves. You wouldn't have lasted a day as a medieval assassin because no one did. The profession was an elaborate form of suicide that happened to take place in shadows. And perhaps that's the most important lesson of all. Some dreams are nightmares in disguise, and some paths lead only to destruction. If you've made it through this entire deep dive into medieval horror, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more journeys into history's darkest corners. Drop a comment and let me know what other impossible medieval professions you'd like me to cover. Though I warn you, there are plenty more ways the Middle Ages could have killed you that we haven't even touched on. Until next time, sleep peacefully, knowing that whatever problems you face in your modern life, at least you're not trying to survive as a medieval assassin, because that's one historical experience that no one, absolutely no one, should ever want to have. Sweet dreams, and thanks for joining me on this journey through the shadows of the past. The medieval world was full of monsters, but sometimes the most dangerous ones were the ordinary people trying desperately to survive in it.